Chapter 11:51. I want to eat Thai food. Curry. Savadakar. Old Mrs. Shun shouted excitedly. She dragged Lily along and said, Lily, do you like curry very much? Let's go eat curry together. Lily looked at Shun Julia strangely. Shun Julia shrugged and said, Grandma likes curry very much. I didn't tell her that you like it. Look, Lily and I are really connected. Julia, lead the way. Let's go together. Old Mrs. Shun pulled Lily out. Lily quickly pushed her away and went inside to get her bag before they went out together. Lily hadn't turned on her phone since last night. As soon as she turned it on, messages and calls came in continuously. Holding in her hand, the phone rang for several seconds before it stopped. Shun Julia and old Mrs. Shun stared at her phone curiously. Lily clicked on it and found that several of them were Shun Julia's numbers. There were also two unfamiliar numbers from the capital. Needless to say, they must be old Mrs. Shun's. Then, there were O Ming's number, Xiao Ziqing's number, and the landline number in Kingstown. Needless to say, they were all from O Ming. Lily looked at the time. It was already 1 p.m. At this time, O Ming couldn't have eaten yet, could he? When the three of them got out of the elevator, Lily regretted her decision and said, Why don't you go eat first? I have something urgent to deal with. As he spoke, he reached out and pulled the old lady out of the neighborhood. There's a big shopping mall about a kilometer up ahead. There's a Thai restaurant there. Shun Julia, take your grandmother there. I won't be going. How can you do that? My grandmother came all the way to find you, and you're not even willing to have a meal with her? Shun Julia looked angry and said, You're too heartless. Lily felt a headache coming on and said, I really have something to do. I was just about to go out to do that, okay. Old Mrs. Shun looked a little regretful. She lowered her head and said, Then go do what you need to do. Will you go home tonight? Yes. As compensation, will you sleep with me tonight? Old Mrs. Shun looked at Lily with a pair of cloudy old eyes and some expectations. When Lily saw the look in his eyes, she felt even more sorry for him. She could see that the old lady really liked her. She had called several times, and now she had come all the way from the capital to play with her. If she continued to ignore him, Lily wouldn't be able to live with herself. If she didn't eat with O Ming, he wouldn't be able to. Facing the expectant look in the old lady's eyes, Lily finally nodded her head and said, All right, I'll see you tonight. The old lady was finally happy. With a smile on her face, she stretched out her finger to Lily and said, Okay, then pinky swear with Grandma. Lily was surprised. How could this old lady be? But facing her expectant eyes, Lily still stuck out her finger. You have you. You. Shin smiled and said, You Lily. You. This is called taking a step back in order to advance. You see, I can be alone with her tonight. Chapter 11:52. Shun Julia sympathized with Lily in his heart. When he turned his head and saw the expectant look on old Mrs. Shun's face, he suddenly felt a little strange. Could it be that Grandma has been lonely for so many years, and she wants to have a twilight romance with Lily? Is it really okay for an old cow to bite on young grass? Furthermore, both of them are women. Shun Julia suddenly felt a chill run down his spine, and his whole body trembled. What a pervert! Old Mrs. Shun had no idea what her grandson thought of her. All she could think about was what was going to happen that night. When Lily got into the taxi, she called O Ming. O Ming hung up the phone and didn't pick it up. Lily was stunned and dialed again. The second call was answered. O Ming picked up the phone and said, I accidentally pressed the button just now. Lily understood and changed the subject. Have you eaten yet? No. I'm waiting for you to eat with me. Where are you? O Ming's voice was low, and his tone was dependent. Did you just wake up? Yeah, I accidentally overslept. I'm in the car now, and I'll be there soon. After thinking for a moment, she asked, Did you shower last night? No. Did you wipe yourself? No. Why? I couldn't wring the towel out. O Ming's words carried a hint of grievance. Lily smiled at his pitiful words and asked, Your mother didn't help you? I'm already an adult, and I still need my mother to help me shower. What'd I look like? Aren't you ashamed to let me shower? Lily was clearly not convinced. You're my woman. It's different. The words came out naturally. Lily's heart fluttered, and her lips curved up. I'll hang up first. I'm almost there. Okay. The car stopped very quickly. Lily paid the driver and got out. After she rang the doorbell, Xiao Ziqing opened the door. When she saw that it was Lily, Xiao Ziqing quietly let out a sigh of relief and rebuked. Why are you only here now? What time is it? Lily was a little unhappy when she heard that tone, but she pretended not to hear it. She called out, Auntie. With that, she walked straight up the stairs. Wait a minute. Have you eaten? Xiao Ziqing asked. Lily stopped and turned her head to look at him. Xiao Ziqing came out of the kitchen with a tray and said, Ming hasn't eaten yet. He's waiting for you to eat together, so I prepared food for two. Thank you, Auntie. Lily took it and headed upstairs. Xiao Ziqing had intended to say more, but seeing Lily in front of her, she had no choice but to swallow the words that were on the tip of her tongue. She felt a little dissatisfied. The door to Ming's room was open. Ming was sitting on the sofa next to the bed. In front of him was a table with a computer and a mobile phone. As soon as he entered, he heard the sound of the computer reading. Ming's fingers flew over the keyboard, and, at the same time, the computer played all the words he had typed. There wasn't a single typo in the entire row. Lily clicked her tongue and said, It's time to eat. Ming's hand stopped, and he turned his head. His eyes were still empty and lifeless. Did my mom say anything to you? She asked me to bring food up to eat with you. That's all. That's it. Is she supposed to say something to me? Chapter 1153. Lily blinked her eyes. She suddenly recalled Xiao Ziqing's hesitant expression earlier. So this was what he wanted to say. However, but I don't want to. She placed a tray on a nearby table and said, Ming, when your hand gets better, I won't be coming anymore. Why? Your mother hates me. She had also made it clear last night that she could not accept Lily. Instead of facing her sarcasm and ridicule every day, it would be better to just not come anymore. She couldn't stand it. Ming reached out with his uninjured hand. Let's move out. Let's go back to my apartment. We'll live together. I can't take good care of you. Ming. She didn't have that right now. And Xiao Ziqing wouldn't allow it. I want to be with you, and no one can stop me. Ming held his hand up, waiting for her to hold it. Looking at his hand, Lily gently pressed his hand down and said, Let's eat. However, it was this small movement that made Ming's heart suddenly turn cold. She did not hold his hand. Has it begun? She was impatient and disdainful. Had she thought it through? Did she not want to live with him? A blind man? Did she not want to marry a blind man? Ming's heart felt like it was being crushed by a big stone. It was terribly heavy. Lily noticed the slight change in Ming's mood, and her eyes darkened. She immediately picked up the bowl and chopsticks to feed him. Throughout the meal, neither of them spoke a word. After eating, Lily packed up the food and sent it to the kitchen to wash and dry. When she went upstairs, she found that the door was locked. Lily couldn't open the door and was stunned. She reached out and patted him, calling out tentatively, Ming. No response. Ming leaned against the sofa and closed his eyes. He listened to the sounds coming from outside, indifferent. The knocking on the door became more and more urgent, and Lily's voice became more and more anxious. Ming, what are you doing inside? Open the door. When Ming heard this, he suddenly felt that it was ridiculous. What did that mean? Afraid that he would die? Afraid that he would commit suicide? Laughing at himself, Ming clearly felt that his eyes were wet and hot. In the eyes of others, he was so weak, so pitiful. Even if he was blind or disabled, as long as he wasn't dead, he wasn't finished. But why were all the people around her like this? His mother was like that, and so was Lily. All of them sympathized with him and treated him like a cripple. She was clearly so unwilling. So why did she still come? It was only because he was crippled and threatened them by not eating. That was all, right? Sadly, Ming realized that apart from being disabled, he didn't have any other weapons. Enough, Ming said. His voice was not loud, but it was just loud enough for the people outside to hear. You can go back. I'll rest for a while. Lily's heart ached. She knocked on the door again and panicked. I'll accompany you. Can you open the door? Let's go back. Ming's voice was even lower and hoarser. At the same time, there seemed to be a hint of a smile, but there was an indescribable sorrow in it. I want to be alone for a while. Don't come. Don't ever come again. This way, he wouldn't feel uncomfortable, and he wouldn't be bullied and humiliated by his mother. He was too selfish. He never thought about her feelings. It won't happen again. Chapter 1154. Lily heard that something was wrong with Ming. Her heart was squeezed tightly, and she couldn't breathe. Lily withdrew her hand and didn't knock on the door again. Looking at the door in front of her, Lily took a step back and leaned against the railing on the second floor. Xiao Ziqing saw Lily leaning against the railing and asked, "What's wrong?" Lily turned her head and shook her head. Then a white light flashed in her mind, and she went forward to knock on the door and said, "Ming, if you want me to leave, you have to let me pick up my things. My bag is still inside." When Ming heard that, he fumbled for her bag on the sofa. Soon, he found it, picked up the shoulder strap, and groped his way to the door. His footsteps were not big, and every step was very slow. When he opened the door, Ming reached out and was about to hand her the bag, but no one reached out to take it. Lily looked at his empty eyes, and her eyes were sad. Lily stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist. Ming was shocked. Obviously, he didn't expect that Lily would do such a thing. "What's wrong? You just finished eating, and you have to be in a good mood. How can you be so bad?" Lily gently leaned on his chest, and her voice softened. "You didn't take a bath or wipe yourself yesterday. I'll help you take a bath and wipe yourself, okay?" Her voice was soft, and every word was extremely gentle. But this was not Lily. His little carp would not talk to him in such a tone as if she was coaxing a child, and she would not be so inexplicably gentle to him. That was the difference. Their attitudes clearly told him this cruel fact. He was disabled. Gently pushing her away, Ming said without any expression, "Go back." As he spoke, he handed Lily's bag forward and said, "I'm sleepy, and I want to sleep. Didn't you sleep well last night?" Lily did not let go and gently pushed him in. "I'll go with you." I said no. Ming's tone suddenly changed, and there was impatience in his anger. "Are you going or not?" Lily was stunned by his roar. Looking at him, she couldn't believe it. "Ming, do you really want me to go?" "Let's go." Another shout rang out. Indistinctly, anger surged. Lily pursed her lips and looked at him. Her breathing gradually became faster. She took the bag from his hand and said in a low voice, "I got it. I'll leave now." Ming's heart was in so much pain that he was hysterical. It was as if someone had taken a knife and pried it open. Blood gushed out violently, and everything inside was blurred by the blood. Ming took a step forward, but he quickly stopped. Lily didn't notice his subtle movements. She turned her body slightly and said, "I'll come again when you're in a better mood." After entering the room, he slammed the door fiercely, making a loud noise. Sorrow, accompanied by such a loud noise, came surging. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring everything. Lily opened her mouth and stopped walking. Her body fell against the wall, and she whimpered. Ming closed the door and locked it. When he turned around, it was still dark. There was no change at all. Chapter 1155. Xiao Ziqing's attention was soon attracted by the low sobbing sounds upstairs. Xiao Ziqing heard the noise and walked over. When Lily heard the movement, she quickly wiped her face and stood up. Xiao Ziqing happened to see Lily squatting by the wall and sobbing. She looked at her face, which had turned pink from all the crying, and frowned. "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" "I'm fine." Lily wiped her face and forced a smile. "Auntie, Ming might not be in a good mood. Can I stay here? Stay outside?" Xiao Ziqing frowned. When she saw Lily's request, she felt even more uncomfortable. What did that mean? Can I stay here? Does that mean that Lily is worried that I won't even let her stay in the corner? Xiao Ziqing understood what was going on and felt extremely displeased. Xiao Ziqing gave Lily a look. She didn't object or agree. She walked toward Ming's room. He gently knocked on the door and shouted, "Son, are you inside? Open the door." There was no immediate response from inside. Lily was also looking forward to the person inside to reply. After about 10 seconds, Ming said, "Mom, I'll be alone for a while. Don't come in." "Are you in a bad mood? Why don't you tell Mommy about it? Maybe she'll be in a better mood?" Xiao Zicheng was clearly unwilling to give up. One had to know that she had scolded this woman several times. Every time, she didn't get any benefit from it. But now, Ming could make this stubborn girl cry like this. What had he done? Furthermore, Ming was usually so protective of this woman. How could he bear to let her cry like this? There's something wrong with him. It's okay. I'm tired. I'm going to sleep, Ming said. His voice was a little gloomy. Other than being in a bad mood, there was no other emotion in his voice. When Xiao Zicheng heard that, she had no choice but to give up. She turned to look at Yulili and said, "Come down and talk." Yulili looked at Xiao Zicheng and felt a little uneasy. When they went downstairs, Xiao Zicheng made a cup of tea for Yulili and asked, "Did you quarrel with Ming?" She took the tea and shook her head. "What's going on?" Yulili also wanted to ask what was going on. Even Yulili couldn't figure out why Ming had suddenly treated her that way. The tears that she had suppressed with great difficulty suddenly gushed out again. Yulili took a deep breath and tried to make herself look refreshed. She said, "It's probably because Ming wants to be alone for a while. He's in a bad mood, but thankfully he just finished eating." When Xiao Zicheng saw Yulili in this state, no matter how much she disliked her, she couldn't help feeling a little sad. She looked at Yulili with disdain and said, "Why are you crying when you're so ugly? My son isn't dead yet. Since my son has chased you out, you should go back first. When he comes looking for you again, I'll call you over." Yulili looked at Xiao Zicheng and said, "What are you crying for when you're so ugly?" When Yulili heard that, she panicked and said, "Auntie, Ming is only temporarily in a bad mood. He'll be fine when he's in a better mood. Can I sit here for a while?" Xiao Zicheng didn't say anything. Yulili quickly added, "If you think I'm taking up space, I can go to Ming's door. That way, I can hear him whenever he calls out to me." Chapter 1156. Yulili quickly got up and went to Ming's door without even taking a sip of tea. Xiao Zicheng just glanced at her and went out on her own. However, Yulili stayed there for more than an hour. During this time, Ming didn't come out. Yulili stood at the door, her mind blank. Suddenly, her phone vibrated and rang. It was a text message. Yulili opened the text message. It was from Ming. A text message from Ming? A string of numbers. 985454966363367468222. What does it mean? Yulili looked at it for a long time, but she didn't know what it meant. She called Ming. Through the door, she heard the ringtone. It was very soft. Yulili listened to the ringtone, waiting for Ming to pick up. But no matter how many times she called, Ming didn't pick up. Feeling a little frustrated, Yulili stood in the same place and didn't move. All of a sudden, the door opened. Yulili was happy. She was about to go up and call him, but then she immediately shut her mouth and didn't dare to move. What does he want to do? Ming walked out and shouted, "Mom, next time Yulili comes, don't let her in." Yulili's heart jumped when she heard that. What does Ming mean? Don't let her in? Then who is it that had been sticking to her these past few days, wanting her to accompany him? Ming didn't seem to notice that there was another person not far away. He shouted, "Mom, are you there?" No one answered. Ming turned and walked back in. Just as he was about to close the door, Yulili went up and pushed the door open. Ming paused and said, "You haven't left yet? Why? What do you mean by asking your mom not to let me in? Didn't you hear it? Why are you asking?" Ming pretended to close the door. Although his eyes were empty and his arm was in a cast, his strength was no less than Yulili's. "Why, Ming, what do you mean? I just sent you a message. Didn't you see it?" A message. Yulili was stunned and thought of the pile of numbers. It was highly likely that Ming had pressed the wrong key and changed the keyboard to numeric. Ming responded calmly. He didn't feel that anything was wrong. Yulili didn't dare say that he had actually sent a bunch of numbers. She played dumb and said, "I didn't look at it. I'll check it out later." Ming was used to typing 9 on his phone's keyboard. Yulili only needed to type the numbers to know what they meant. "Then you can go back first." Ming slammed the door hard, but he couldn't close it. Yulili used all her strength to resist and shouted, "Why are you chasing me away? Did I do something wrong?" "You didn't do anything wrong. I was the one who was wrong." Ming thought to himself, but he couldn't say it out loud. Or Did I say something that made you unhappy? Tell me, okay? Why are you suddenly in a bad mood? Why are you suddenly chasing me away? Oh Ming, you're already like this. Don't be angry with me, okay? What do you mean I'm already like this? Oh Ming loosened his grip, and his face darkened. I'm disabled and blind, so I don't even have the right to be angry, right? No, Lily said. Then what do you mean? Do you think that I should beg you to be with me? I don't care. Lily, go away. I don't want to see or hear you. Ming's face was only gloomy and emotionless. Lily looked at him and knew that his mood must be terrible. Otherwise, he wouldn't have said such things. Chapter 11:57. Lily stopped moving, but she did not retreat. Looking at Ming in front of her, Lily's eyes were filled with compassion and regret that Ming couldn't see. Ming, it's not that you beg me to be with you, but that I can't leave you. Have you forgotten what I said? I must marry you, and you must marry me. Isn't that right? Lily took a step forward and grabbed his hand. In her voice, there was a bit of pleading. You promised me. Do you want to break your promise now? I know you are in a bad mood, but don't say such things in the future, okay? Although she knew that he was unhappy because of his misfortune, hearing such words still made Lily's heart hurt. It hurt a lot. Such a feeling was more hurtful than any of Qiao Ziqing's words. The pain of a lover was far deeper, more turbulent, and more painful than that of an unrelated person. Ming clearly felt the emotions coming from Lily. He held her with his hand, and his chest was slightly trembling. Why would he want to say something like that? But when he thought of the possibility that he would never recover his eyesight, and Qiao Ziqing's deep misunderstanding of him and Lily, Ming's heart was indescribably sad. Ming pushed her away with a backhand. He didn't say anything, but his hand was very strong. Lily was caught off guard when she was pushed. He slammed the door shut and locked it from the inside. Ming, open the door. Lily was inexplicably flustered. Everything was fine just now. What suddenly happened? Didn't he eat when they first arrived? Why did he suddenly change? Lily slammed the door and shouted, Ming, open the door. Tell me clearly, what do you mean? Does it mean that he doesn't want to marry me? Does it mean that he doesn't want to answer? Why didn't he say it clearly? Lily didn't understand, but looking at the tightly closed door in front of her, the panic in her heart became more and more rampant. Go and check the message. In the future, let's not see each other. Ming's words came through the door. It was muffled but very clear. Lily heard his words clearly. She quickly picked up the phone and looked at the string of numbers. She typed it out according to the numbers. 9 key pinyin 985454966363367468222 after Lily punched out. Her heart was even more shocked. Lily, let's break up. Cinder, bitcho, go take a look at the messages. In the future, let's not meet again. What Ming had just said rang in her mind. Lily held the phone and looked at the words that automatically came to mind. She couldn't believe it. How could this be? How could this be? Ming told her to break up? How could this be? How could this be? Ming, what do you mean by this? I don't understand. Open the door and explain it to me. Open the door? What do you mean? Ming, what do you mean by this? Come out and explain it to me. Open the door. Open the door. Ming's voice trembled a little, and he slammed the door even harder. However, no matter how hard she shouted or how loud she shouted, the person inside did not move. Ming sat on the ground and leaned against the wall. He could clearly feel the coldness from his back. Chapter 11:58. She saw it, and she understood it. That's all right. Ming got up from the ground, walked to the bed, and slowly sat down. Outside, Lily's voice was getting louder and louder. At the same time, it was getting crazier and more hysterical. In the end, the sound of Lily hitting the door was getting softer and softer, and the original voice had collapsed into sobs. Ming leaned against the bed and bit his lower lip, trying not to make a sound. Tears flowed down from the corner of his eyes, and the salty taste, with the smell of weakness, was so strong that it was embarrassing. That's it. Ming's head was getting dizzier, and he fell asleep on the bed. Even Ming himself didn't know how long he had been sleeping. Because he couldn't see, he couldn't even tell the difference between day and night. Standing up, Ming felt a throbbing pain in his arm. Gently stroking it, Ming stood up and opened the door. Outside, it was quiet. Lily was gone. In order to be able to see Lily at any time, Sean Juliet took the old lady to a coffee shop downstairs in the neighborhood where Lily lived. People could be seen coming and going at any time. Kingstown was a first-tier city. Basically, at this time of the year, the whole city could be called an empty city. Old Mrs. Shin leaned on the table and stared outside, for fear of missing Lily's arrival. Shin Juliet sat opposite the old lady, playing a game on his phone. The killing game kept coming, and Shun Juliet was very excited. Suddenly, the old lady stood up and shouted, Lily is back. With that, she didn't give Shun Juliet any time to recover from his shock. She quickly ran out of the room. Shun Juliet quickly turned off the game, caught up with her, and shouted, Grandma, Lily won't come back at this time. You'd better sit here quietly. When Lily comes back, maybe she'll think you've done a good job and spend more time with you alone. However, Shun Juliet's words didn't work. The old lady walked faster, like an old child, and happily shouted, Lily, you're back? Lily hadn't expected the old lady to appear in front of her so quickly. She rubbed her eyes and tried her best to look natural as she asked, Old Mrs. Shun, what are you doing here? When old Mrs. Shun heard this form of address, she was unhappy and said, What old lady? Can you call me Grandma? I've been waiting for you here for a long time. Shall we go eat Thai food now? You guys didn't eat lunch? No, Shun Julia replied. You sounded a little helpless. Grandma said that she had to wait for you to go with her. So, we settled around here the afternoon. As he spoke, he noticed that Lily's eyes were visibly red and swollen. Shun Julia wasn't the only one who saw through it. Even old Mrs. Shun, who had always behaved like a child in front of Lily, acted as if she hadn't seen it. She walked up to Lily affectionately and took her arm. Shall we go now? Old Mrs. Shun was pleasantly surprised. He knew Lily would come back, but he didn't know it would be so early. But at the same time, he did not expect Lily to come back in such a state. The old man's heart ached. After all, she had lived for decades. Old Mrs. Shun could roughly guess the reason for Lily's current state. Chapter 11:59. Lily nodded as the old lady held her arm affectionately. His red and swollen eyes looked a little miserable at this moment. Lily reached out to press her eyes, but old Mrs. Shun pulled her hand away. She rebuked, You can't rub your eyes if they are uncomfortable. The more you rub them, the more uncomfortable they will be. It's better to wear glasses when the wind is strong. As he spoke, he slowly stretched out his hand toward Shun Juliet and said, Old man, glasses. Shun Juliet hurriedly took out a pair of sunglasses from the bag he was carrying, arched his back, and jumped onto it with small steps. In a shrill voice, he said, Your Highness, the glasses have arrived. His appearance was extremely comical. Old Mrs. Shun laughed and took the glasses. When she looked at Lily, she realized that she wasn't smiling like she was. Here, this is for you. Old Mrs. Shun pushed it toward Lily. Put it on. It'll protect you from the wind. Lily's heart warmed. She didn't even have to look to know that her eyes were swollen. She didn't stand on ceremony. She took the glasses from old Mrs. Shun and thanked her before leading old Mrs. Shun and Shun Julia toward the mall ahead. When they arrived at the Thai restaurant, a girl in traditional Thai clothes came out to welcome the guests. She put her palms together and said to them, Savadika. Old Mrs. Shun also bowed to her and said, Sawadika. Even the waitress couldn't help but laugh as she led them into a private room. After ordering, old Mrs. Shun looked a little excited. She looked at Lily and said, Lily, this is the first time I've been to a Thai restaurant in Kingstown. I heard that Kingstown is close to Thailand. Why don't we go to Thailand together? When Shin Julia heard that, he couldn't help but make things difficult for her. He coughed lightly and said, Grandma, we didn't bring our passports. Ask your brother to send it over. The delivery service is not open. When the old lady heard that, she was displeased. She turned to glare at Shun Julia and said, Go back and get it. I'll wait for you in Kingstown. That's not a good idea. You'll fall apart if you keep running around. Shun Julia exclaimed. I don't care. In any case, I'm going to Thailand with Lily. Hurry up and get me my passport. Old Mrs. Shun had her arms akimbo. She was being unreasonable. Who asked you to be my grandson? Shun Jilia was speechless. Are you sure this isn't a curse? But when he thought about it carefully, it didn't seem to be wrong. Shun Jilia frowned, but when he turned his head, he saw that Lily's lips were slightly raised. Shun Jilia felt slightly relieved, but then he said unhappily, even if I'm your grandson, you can't mistreat me like this. Am I still your biological son? I didn't give birth to you in the first place. The old lady didn't find anything wrong with that. She looked at Lily and asked, Lily, do you want to go? If they went, the youngest would go to the capital. The journey there would take 3 hours, and the round trip would only take 6 hours. Even if he takes 3 hours to travel to and from the airport, that's only 9 hours. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon now, so he should be back by midnight. When Shun Jilia heard that, he exploded and yelled, Grandma, my dear grandma, are you trying to kill your grandson? What, you don't want to go? I don't want to, of course I don't. Such an arduous task was not something that just anyone could accomplish. But Chapter 1160. It doesn't matter. Leave it to me. You can go. Lily's lips curled up slightly, but her sunglasses were still on. Seeing the smile on Lily's face, Shun Jilia and old Mrs. Shun both breathed a sigh of relief. Shun Jilia immediately pretended to be unhappy and shouted, Hey, my grandmother is bullying me, and you're bullying me too, right? What? Old Mrs. Shun glared at him. Call me Lily. Shun Jilia turned his head and shrank his neck when he heard the old lady's words. He picked up his glass and took a sip. Seeing Shun Jilia's behavior, Lily's smile became even wider. An indescribable feeling spread through her. Her heart felt warm, but it also felt like a feather was gently tickling it. It was so comfortable that she couldn't help but want to reject it. This was the first time she had eaten with someone other than Ming and her colleagues, especially on such a special day. It was a wonderful feeling. The dishes were quickly served, and old Mrs. Shun quickly began to eat. Although old Mrs. Shun was not young, her appetite was still very good. Lily had eaten not long ago, but she didn't eat much. Shun Jilia had also eaten most of the food for old Mrs. Shun. This was after Shun Jilia had stopped her several times. Otherwise, Lily would have suspected that the old lady would have eaten even more. After eating, Shun Jilia paid the bill. Old Mrs. Shun had accidentally eaten too much and needed a walk to digest her food. She took Lily with her and walked around the mall. Big malls didn't close during the new year, so there were still a lot of things to shop. However, the new year still had the atmosphere of the new year. The same song, Winter Jasmine, was played everywhere. As he walked with the old lady, she became more and more interested in the song. She even shouted at the top of her lungs, Love, oh winter jasmine, flowers bloom everywhere. Many shop assistants looked over, and Shun Jilia quickly hid in the side. Lily was pulled by the old lady and shouted at the top of her lungs. As she walked, she turned to look at Lily with a big smile on her face. Shun Jilia covered his face and hid in the side. When he looked over, he found that Lily was also smiling at his grandmother. It seemed that she was no longer as impatient as she was at noon. Shun Jilia's heart calmed down a little, and there was a look of relief in his eyes. Although he didn't know why his grandmother liked Lily so much, he had to admit that Lily was a very good girl. It was a pity for such a girl to be with a scumbag like Ming. Old Mrs. Shun sang loudly all the way. Many people watched her as she pulled Lily along. Suddenly, the old lady stopped and turned to look at Shun Jilia. She shouted, Shun Jilia, why are you hiding so far away? Is it embarrassing for Grandma? Shun Jilia was stunned. He quickly covered his face as everyone looked at him. He groaned his heart. Oh my God. Just call him, but don't call him by his name, okay? His illustrious name. Shun Jilia smiled sheepishly and said, I'm paving the way. Paving the way. With that, he ran off like a wisp of smoke. Old Mrs. Shun glared at him. She grabbed Lily's hand and chased after Shun Jilia. She shouted, Stop right there. Chapter 1161. When old Mrs. Shun heard that, she felt a little proud. When she turned to look at Lily, her eyes were full of pride. Am I very powerful? Lily pursed her lips and nodded. Very powerful. Old Mrs. Shun was even more proud. She laughed and chased after Shun Julia. Shun Julia, who was in front, was secretly shocked. He shouted, "Grandma, slow down. Do you want to die?" When old Mrs. Shun heard that, she was unhappy and shouted, "What do you mean?" Shun Julia cried bitterly in his heart, and his expression immediately changed. With an apologetic look on his face, he stepped forward and said, "Grandma, I was wrong." Old Mrs. Shin glared at him and reached out to pull his ear up. "What did you do wrong?" "Everything is wrong." Shinjilia admitted defeat. Especially after seeing Lily's faint smile, he became even more terrified. He cried out in pain, "It hurts! It hurts!" More and more people were watching. Shinjilia covered his face in shame. Grandma, let's go. I'll take you somewhere else to play." Lily removed old Mrs. Shun's hand. After helping Shun Julia out, she took the old lady's hand and walked forward. When old Mrs. Shun heard that, she was very happy. She nodded and took Lily's arm affectionately. She strode forward. Just like that, a few hours passed. Although old Mrs. Shun was physically strong, she was old. At about 7 or 8 o'clock, Shinjulia forced the old lady to go back. Naturally, the old lady was very reluctant. In the end, Lily persuaded her to go back. Shinjulia and the old lady took Lily to the hotel. It was a famous 5-star hotel in Kingstown. Shinjulia had booked a suite with 2 rooms. Just as Shinjulia asked the old lady to take a shower, old Mrs. Shin seemed to be afraid that Lily would go back on her word. She hugged Lily's arm and said with a pair of old eyes, "Lily, you said you would sleep with me tonight." Lily smiled and said, "Well, I won't go back on my word." Old Mrs. Shun was relieved and went to take a shower. However, Lily didn't bring any clothes. She was temporarily wearing a hotel bathrobe. When he came out, the old lady was sitting on the bed, holding a tablet and playing a popular game. It was simple, yet not so simple, comparable to Tetris. Lily leaned over to take a look. Old Mrs. Shun extended the tablet toward her and said, "Come on, let's play together." Lily chuckled and pushed it back. She looked at old Mrs. Shun, deliberated over her words, and said, "Actually, Grandma, I wanted to ask you from the very beginning. Can you answer this question for me?" "What?" Old Mrs. Shun lowered her head and blinked at Lily. Lily felt that the old man was a little cute and asked, "Why do you like me so much?" "My attitude toward you has never been very friendly. You saved me," old Mrs. Shun said without hesitation. She looked at Lily and said mysteriously, "To tell you the truth, I can see a person's fortune." Luck. Chapter 1162. Ever since our old man died, I feel like I've become half a god. When I look at others, if I get along well with them, I can see a layer of fog above their heads. As old Mrs. Shin spoke, she looked at the top of Lily's head. Above everyone's head, there will be a ball of luck that belongs to them. Within this ball of luck, there will be bad luck, good luck, and bad luck. There will always be many storms in one's life, and only in the end can one comfortably welcome the rainbow. Old Mrs. Shun had a smile on her face, but at that moment, she looked different from how she had looked during the day. She was kind, and the wrinkles on her face folded up. She reached out and gently patted her hand. "From the first time I saw you, I knew that you were destined to be with me. Lily, your luck compliments mine. When I first saw you, I felt that you were very likely to be my long-lost granddaughter." Lily blushed with shame. She smiled and asked, "Isn't it Enchanting? That child was also destined to be with our family. As for what kind of fate, I couldn't tell, so I simply brought her home. Who knew she would have such a fate with Shinluoan? What a sin." Although that was what she said, old Mrs. Shin wasn't really that angry. She had expected it, so it was normal for there to be some discrepancies. The Shun family was also a prestigious family in the capital. Enchanting was an orphan. Given such an opportunity to climb the social ladder, she did not hesitate to follow her and even became friends with her. She had thought that Lily would be easy to deal with. Who knew that this girl would hate her so much? Lily's attitude was far beyond old Mrs. Shun's expectations. Her desire to bring her home was aroused. However, It was also during this time that she became more aware of Yu Lily's extraordinary qualities. This girl's life was like a spring. The more pain she could endure, the more happiness she could obtain. The more she was suppressed now, the more she would rebound in the future. In the past, her life was cheap, and in the future, it would be priceless. I don't match your lost granddaughter's age. I don't think I'm... It can't be that granddaughter, right? Rumor had it that old Mrs. Shun was very harsh toward Yi Qianqian's younger sister. If she really became their granddaughter, would she? Old Mrs. Shun didn't notice Yu Lily's worry. She patted her hand and said, "You and I are fated. Regardless of whether we are related by blood or not, I am willing to be friends with you." As she spoke, she quietly looked around and whispered, "Lily, what do you think of our grandson?" This grandson was, of course, referring to Shun Jilya. Yu Lily was speechless. Thinking of Shun Jilya's sloppy appearance, she shook her head and said, "Grandma, don't try to match me up. I'm not interested in Shun Jilya." "What a pity." Old Mrs. Shun patted her hand. "I really don't know what's so good about that old guy. You like him, and my disappointing granddaughter insisted on marrying him. Now I heard that he got into a car accident. What's the situation now?" Hearing that, Yu Lily's eyes dimmed slightly. "Is it serious?" When he saw Yu Lily in the afternoon, she seemed to be crying a lot. From the look of it, he could tell that Ken was seriously injured. Chapter 1163. After old Mrs. Shun said that, she felt like she had asked too many questions. She couldn't even see. Of course, it was serious. It will all pass. That boy is also a blessed man. Yu Lily forced a smile and didn't say anything. The old lady had played the whole day and taken a plane here. She was already very tired. At that moment, she didn't talk to Yu Lily and fell asleep unknowingly. The old lady had a regular schedule. She woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning. When she woke up, Yu Lily was sleeping soundly. Her face was buried under her arms, and her hair covered most of her face. The old lady turned to look at Yu Lily. She looked at Yu Lily's slightly curled up sleeping position. At that moment, she was curled up in the corner of the bed, looking like a child who lacked a sense of security. It was also at that moment that the old lady strongly remembered that she was an orphan who grew up without parents, an orphan who was abandoned when she was born, an orphan who couldn't find her parents. The feeling of loneliness could be felt from her sleeping position. The old lady had never been an emotional person, but at that moment, when she felt this inexplicable atmosphere, she couldn't help but feel a lump in her throat. The old lady looked at Yu Lily for a while. Suddenly, she opened her eyes with a thump. Seeing that old Mrs. Shun was looking at her, Yu Lily remembered where she was. She smiled and said, "Grandma, good morning." "Morning. Did you have a nightmare?" Old Mrs. Shun looked at her kindly. When she saw the tears on her face, her heart ached even more. She reached out and patted her gently on the arm with a slight smile on her face. Yu Lily smiled and wiped the tears on her face. She climbed up and said, "Sort of." Yu Lily's eyes looked much more swollen than yesterday. Coupled with the dried water stains on her face, it wasn't difficult to imagine what kind of dream she had. "What sad dream did you have? Tell me about it." Old Mrs. Shun's voice was soft and slow. It sounded full of love. At the same time, her old and dry hand had already gently touched the ends of Yu Lily's hair. The old lady in front of her was obviously old. Her back was slightly bent, and her face was layered with wrinkles. But at that moment, she gave Yu Lily the warmth of an elder that she had never felt before. Other than O Ming, this was the first person who had spoken to her like this. Yu Lily felt a surge of anger in her chest, and she couldn't control it. Her throat was choked with pain, and tears flowed down. "What's wrong?" Old Mrs. Shun frowned and looked at Yu Lily with sadness in her eyes. Yu Lily couldn't help but burst into tears. She gently hugged the old man and smelled the unique smell of the old man's metabolism. A place in her heart that had been empty for many years suddenly seemed to be filled. Yu Lily was sobbing uncontrollably. Old Mrs. Shin stopped asking. She hugged her gently and gave her silent comfort. "Thank you, Grandma. Did Oming bully you?" Old Mrs. Shun patted Yi Qianqian's back gently and said softly, It just so happens that Grandma hasn't visited them in a long time. Why don't you take Grandma over there and have a seat? Go to the O clan. Chapter 1164. Settle accounts. When Lily heard those two words, her heart warmed again. This was the first time, other than Ming, that someone had said something like that. After being bullied outside, someone came back and said they would help you get revenge and settle accounts. What kind of relationship was that? Family? Family? None of them. But why was this old lady so nice to her? Was it just because she liked her? Lily found it a little strange. When she heard that, she nodded her head. Coincidentally, she was going to look for Ming. If she went alone, Xiao Ziqing wouldn't even let her in. If she brought along the old lady who used to be their in-law, the outcome might be different. When the old lady saw that she had agreed, she was immediately happy. She got up and went to the bathroom to freshen up. Then, they were ready to set off. When everything was ready, it was only a little after 7 o'clock. Shinjilia was still sleeping. Just as Lily was thinking about whether or not to wake him up, the old lady gave her a look to tell her not to. It was 8 o'clock in the morning when they arrived at the O residence. It was old Mrs. Shun who rang the doorbell. Lily hid in the corner, afraid that Xiao Ziqing wouldn't open the door if she saw her through the peephole. However, it wasn't Xiao Ziqing who opened the door. It was Huijin. When Huijin saw old Mrs. Shun, he was very surprised. He called out, "In-law Grandma, why are you here?" In-law Grandma. That was obviously a form of address that had been used since before. It hadn't changed. Old Mrs. Shin nodded her head and said, "I brought my granddaughter here to take a look." As she spoke, she looked at Huijin and asked, "May I come in?" Huijin quickly moved aside and said, "Please come in quickly. The weather is a little cold today. Why aren't you wearing more clothes? Your granddaughter is here too?" "My granddaughter, Shun Manting, is here too? The woman who caused the scandal with her brother? The ex-fiancée of my son?" "Yes, but she's not my biological granddaughter. I adopted her outside." Old Mrs. Shun looked at Huijin confidently. Huijin nodded his head. Shun Manting wasn't her biological granddaughter. Old Mrs. Shun had adopted her outside a few years ago. He wasn't the only one who knew that. Many people in the outside world knew. As he spoke, he looked behind the old lady and called out, "Manting is here too? Why don't you come in?" However, when old Mrs. Han heard Huijin shout, she felt unhappy and retorted, "Who told you it was Manting? I already said it wasn't her." Huijin felt a little awkward. If it wasn't Shin Manting, who could it be? Old Mrs. Shun snorted and looked back. She realized that Lily hadn't followed her in. That made old Mrs. Shin a little unhappy. She shouted, "Lily, what are you doing outside? Come on in." "Lily." When he said that, not only did Huijin feel a little surprised, but even Xiao Ziqing, who had just walked out, was amazed. He subconsciously looked at the door, and sure enough, he saw a familiar figure walking in. Lily. Lily didn't seem to be in a good state today. She only had light makeup on, but it still couldn't hide the red and swollen eyes. It seemed that he was in a much more sorry state than he was yesterday. Chapter 1165. Xiao Ziqing and her husband looked at each other and saw the confusion in each other's eyes. When did Lily become the granddaughter of the Shun family? They hadn't heard anything about it before. Furthermore, Xiao Ziqing had heard a little about how difficult the old lady was to deal with. She had even heard that she had some mental problems. Her mind was often muddled, and she was always spouting nonsense. Furthermore, her mood was erratic and unpredictable. If you made her unhappy in any way, the old lady would flip out at the drop of a hat. Even Shin Manting was often at a loss for what to do with the old lady's erratic personality. How did Lily end up with the old lady? Old Mrs. Shun ignored their astonishment. She turned around and walked over to Lily. She held her arm affectionately and walked toward the living room of the O residence with a smile. Xiao Ziqing was even more stunned when she saw the scene. In the 4 years that Shun Manting had been engaged to Ming, the old lady had come over once or twice, but she had always brought her granddaughter in with the attitude of an elder to discuss marriage and other matters. She was stingy with a smile, let alone holding Shin Manting's hand as they walked in. How did Lily deal with this old lady? Yu Lily felt goosebumps rise under Qiao Ziqing's stare. She looked up and smiled sheepishly. The old lady didn't care. Under the gaze of Qiao Ziqing and Huijin, she swaggered over to the sofa and sat down. Sister Yang, bring me the Jin Jume tea that I brought back before the new year. Huijin shouted into the room. All right. Sister Yang quickly brought the tea over. The way she looked at Yu Lily was also a little strange. A few days ago, Sister Yang had been on leave and hadn't seen Yu Lily, but she was no stranger to the old lady. Now that she saw this unfamiliar granddaughter, she couldn't help but take a second look. Faced with all the strange gazes around her, Yu Lily felt like she was sitting on pins and needles. She felt a little uncomfortable. Everyone had their own thoughts. Qiao Ziqing sat down in front of them and handed old Mrs. Shun some snacks with a smile. She asked, "Why does Grandma have time to come over today? It's the new year. Is everything peaceful in the capital?" The implication was, your family still has a mess to deal with, so why did you come to my house? Old Mrs. Shun had lived for a long time. How could she not understand? She snorted and said, "I heard that your son got into a car accident, so I asked my granddaughter to bring me here to take a look. After all, we used to be in-laws. I don't want people to say that I'm cold. I came here just to hang out with Lily, but I didn't even stop by to take a look." When Qiao Ziqing heard that, she looked at Yu Lily even more. Is he here to look for Yu Lily? In that case, Yu Lily and the old lady had known each other for a long time. Could it be that Yu Lily was not an orphan, but was somehow related to the Shun family? She glanced at Yu Lily, then at the old lady. She nodded her head without changing her expression. "Thank you for your concern, my dear grandmother. Where's your son?" Chapter 1166. When Yu Lily heard that, she knew that the words were directed at her. Looking down at the table, Yu Lily subconsciously clasped her hands together. He's eating well and sleeping soundly. He's in good shape. Shouldn't I be happy to hear that? But, for some reason, Yu Lily felt an indescribable pain in her heart. So, after breaking up with me, he will be in better shape? How is that possible? Yu Lily didn't believe it. But, she saw Qiao Ziqing's relaxed expression. She didn't seem worried about her son at all. Instead, she looked very relaxed and happy. Old Mrs. Shun looked at her and said, "Is that so? That's great. I was worried that something would happen to your son. After all, the engagement between your family and mine hasn't been canceled. In the future, our families will become in-laws. I don't want my granddaughter to marry a cripple." Her words were so direct that it was embarrassing. Yu Lily felt as if a knife had cut into her heart. In that moment, she suddenly felt that everything around her had nothing to do with her. The engagement between Enchanting and Ming hasn't been canceled. So, their engagement hasn't been canceled? After what happened between Enchanting and Luo, and their engagement hasn't been canceled. Yu Lily found it hard to believe. But, looking at the expressions of Qiao Ziqing and Huijin, she knew. It was true. Qiao Ziqing was a little embarrassed and said, "Grandma, how can you say that? Our son. Is your son really a cripple?" Old Mrs. Shun looked at her and asked sharply. Qiao Ziqing's words were stuck in her throat. She didn't know whether to say yes or no. Ming's condition was indeed not good. Not only was he blind, but his hand was also fractured. But how could his parents accept the word cripple? When Yu Lily saw that, she quietly reached out and tugged on old Mrs. Shun's sleeve. In a low voice, she said, "Grandma, Ming is fine." "What do you mean by fine? Is it really as you said? He can't see?" Old Mrs. Shun didn't have the slightest intention of hiding her voice. "Isn't he blind? What's the difference between that and a cripple? Our granddaughter can't marry someone like that." Old Mrs. Shun. A young man's voice came from the second floor. This voice was cold and displeased, and it made one's heart tremble. Yu Lily's heart fluttered. She looked in the direction of the voice and saw Ming in his pajamas. At that moment, Ming's hand was in a cast hanging from his neck. His eyes were looking straight ahead. He looked empty and lifeless, like a puppet. "If you have come to see if I am crippled, you have seen it. I'm blind and crippled, as you know. You may go back." As for Enchanting, what gave her the confidence to believe that I would marry a woman like you, who has ruined our family's reputation? "Oh Ming, can't afford to be cuckolded by my brother." Yu Lily hadn't said a word since she entered the house. Oh Ming knew that old Mrs. Shun hadn't come alone. When he heard her call herself their granddaughter, he naturally assumed that the person who had come was Shun Manting. Chapter 1167. Please go back. It's the new year, and no one will be happy if things go sour. As she spoke, she groped her way downstairs. Such a scene was shocking to the eye. Xiao Ziqing immediately stood up and wanted to walk in Oh Ming's direction, but she was one step too late. Yu Lily's footsteps were fast as she ran in that direction. Oh Ming couldn't see, but he could vaguely guess who it was from the sound of her footsteps. Just as Yu Lily was about to reach him, Oh Ming stopped. "Why are you here?" Oh Ming asked. It was obvious that he had recognized Yu Lily. Xiao Ziqing and Oh Huijin looked at each other and saw different emotions in each other's eyes. Old Mrs. Shun was still sitting on the sofa, drinking tea calmly. She looked at Yu Lily on the second floor with a look of admiration in her eyes. Brave. Not bad. Yu Lily didn't say anything. She walked up to him and grabbed his uninjured arm without a word and pulled him forward. Oh Ming's footsteps were frozen in place. He didn't move an inch. "I thought I made it clear yesterday that we broke up. Yu Lily, what's the point of doing this?" He didn't wait for Yu Lily to speak before he turned to the side and shouted, "Mom, didn't we agree not to let her in?" Hearing that, Xiao Ziqing's heart was filled with doubt. Could Oh Ming be serious? Oh Ming didn't look like he was faking it. Why did he suddenly break up? Xiao Ziqing wasn't the only one who was curious. Even Yu Lily herself was baffled. "Oh Ming," Yu Lily shouted, "why are you saying something like that for no reason? You have to give me a reason. I didn't meet you yesterday, so don't even think of escaping today. You have to give me an explanation, or I won't leave." Yes, for no reason. No one would be willing to accept such a situation. Even Oh Ming himself wouldn't easily accept such a sudden breakup. Could he tell her that he had thought it through and didn't want to hold her up any longer? Could he tell her that he didn't want her to be a cripple for the rest of her life, and that she should find another way out and find another man? If he said that, Yu Lily would be even more unwilling to break up with him. Oh Ming knew her very well. Yu Lily was a good girl, and it was precisely because of this that he could not delay her. It was very likely that he would be like this for the rest of his life, blind, forever in need of others to take care of him, unable to work, becoming a burden to his family and his parents, forever living in darkness, never to see the light of day. Furthermore, Xiao Ziqing's opinion of Yu Lily was huge. It wasn't something that could be changed overnight. He couldn't afford it, and he didn't want Yu Lily to compromise because of him. Hearing Yu Lily's words, Oh Ming's heart tightened. He wanted to pull his hand back, but Yu Lily's hands were holding him tightly. Oh Ming couldn't push her away with just one hand. He simply let her hug him and said coldly, "A man doesn't want a woman who is greedy for money and vanity. Isn't that a reason?" Yu Lily felt a stab in her heart. She looked at Oh Ming in disbelief. "Are you talking about me? Is there someone else besides you?" Chapter 1168. Yu Lily's voice was filled with disbelief. She unconsciously loosened her grip on Oh Ming. Oh Ming took the opportunity to pull his hand back and said, "I'm denouncing my ex-girlfriend. She did all the hypocritical things she could. On the surface, she treated me impeccably, but in reality, she was willing to do anything to marry me. Outsiders must think that you're loyal, but do you think I don't know your true colors? You want to marry me, then use all means to get a divorce and get a large share of the alimony, right?" The more Yu Lily listened, the more unreasonable she found it. Such a reason? Such a reason? Nonsense! Yu Lily roared. "Oh Ming, you're crazy. What nonsense are you talking about? Do you think I care about your family's money? If you don't care, why won't you break up with me? If you don't care, why are you still pestering me?" Oh Ming retorted. His tone was urgent. "My mother is right. Orphans like you are hypocritical. You grew up without parents, so you don't know anything about relationships." Xiao Ziqing was caught off guard. She was stunned. Oh Huijin was equally baffled. No one had expected that in just a few days, the relationship between Oh Ming and Yu Lily would change so much. Apart from Oh Ming himself, no one could understand what he meant. Yu Lily's body trembled with anger. She looked at Ming, and even her breathing became rapid. Ming took advantage of the situation and said, "You were with me because of this from the beginning, weren't you? You were with me because I was rich and healthy. Now that I'm disabled, the most important thing—" Slap! A loud slap interrupted Ming's words. Ming's head was buzzing. It was as if a swarm of flies were flying around his ears. Xiao Ziqing's eyes widened, and she shouted, "You be *TCH? How dare you hit my son?" As she said that, she flew forward. Ming laughed coldly. "Are you angry because your secret has been exposed? You Lily, aren't you very tolerant? Now you're—" Slap! Another vicious slap landed on Ming's face. Neither side of his face was spared. Ming's head was dizzy, and his body swayed. You Lily didn't expect Ming to be so fragile. The wounds on both sides of Ming's cheeks, which were wrapped in gauze, quickly oozed blood. Looking at his wobbly body, you Lily subconsciously wanted to go forward and hold him, but she was pushed away harshly. You Lily was caught off guard and stumbled. Xiao Ziqing's anxious voice could be heard. She cried out to Ming, "Son." Ming's head buzzed, and he barely managed to steady himself. Xiao Ziqing supported him. His surroundings were murky, and he felt a little dizzy. His heart ached, as if it was being sliced into pieces. In the darkness, Ming could clearly feel the tears seeping from the corner of his eyes. He laughed coldly and said with some sadness, "Do you see that? I can't even avoid a woman's slap now. Do you fancy a man like that? How dare you say it's not for the money?" You Lily, you are so hypocritical. You Lily's heart had originally felt sorry for him, but now it was all gone. This kind of man, she must be blind to have fallen in love with this kind of man. She should have seen through it a long time ago. Was the lesson in the nightclub and the hospital not deep enough? Chapter 1169. It couldn't be changed, no matter what she did, no matter how much effort she put in, or how infatuated she was. Ming seemed to believe that she had ulterior motives. It had happened once, twice, and this was already the third time. Ming, I must have been *king blind. You Lily didn't cry. Her eyes were filled with determination and desolation. She looked at the pitiful man in front of her and laughed coldly. "Remember what you said today, Ming. From now on, I won't come looking for you again. You better not come begging me. Otherwise, I'll despise you just like you despised me today. You better not give me that chance." With that, you Lily turned around and quickly walked down the stairs. Faced with Huajin's meaningful gaze, you Lily's heart ached. She quickly walked to the sofa, picked up her handbag, and ran out the door. Once she was out the door, you Lily's mood was surprisingly calm. There were no waves of emotions that she had imagined, no overflowing sorrow that she had imagined. Instead, there was an indescribable calmness. She couldn't even shed a tear. You Lily stood at the door, waiting for the old lady to come out. She didn't know what the old lady was doing inside. After a few minutes, she came out. When she saw that you Lily was waiting for her, the old lady went up to her and said, "Child, you're a good child." When you Lily heard that, she tried her best to smile at old Mrs. Shun, but her muscles were tense. She couldn't force out a smile at all. Old Mrs. Shun looked at you Lily and reached out to gently push her hair back. "If you can't bring yourself to smile, then don't. Let's go back." "Okay." You Lily lowered her gaze and led the old lady out to hail a taxi. At that moment, a taxi stopped. It had been busy, but now it was empty. You Lily and the old lady waited for the person in the taxi to get out. Unexpectedly, they saw a familiar face. Wen Fenglin was a little surprised to see you Lily there. You Lily greeted, "Uncle Wen." Wen Fenglin nodded his head and smiled. Two deep dimples appeared on both sides of his cheeks. He looked very kind and benevolent. He looked at you Lily and was about to speak when his gaze inadvertently landed on the old lady beside you Lily. He froze. When old Mrs. Shun saw Wen Fenglin, she paused for a moment as well. Her murky eyes shone with a sharp light as she asked, "It's you? You know each other?" You Lily was surprised. She looked at the old lady and then at Wen Fenglin. Why does it feel like the relationship between them isn't very good? When Wen Fenglin saw old Mrs. Shun, the smile on his face disappeared. He asked, "When did you come to Kingstown?" As for the imperial capital, old Mrs. Shun looked at Wenfeng Lin. Her face darkened, and she laughed mirthlessly. What? Are you going to pick me up after I ask? Or are you going to treat me to a meal? You haven't eaten? Wenfeng Lin asked with surprise. Why don't we... Forget it. Old Mrs. Shun looked at him and laughed mirthlessly. If you treat me to a meal, I'm afraid my lifespan will be shortened. With that, she pulled Lily to open the door of the taxi and said, Lily, let's go. Before Lily had time to digest the relationship between them, old Mrs. Shun had already pulled her into the car. Lily turned her head and smiled at Wenfeng Lin. She looked apologetic. The old lady got the driver to drive off. Wenfeng Lin watched as the taxi drove away. His eyes were cold and desolate. Chapter 1170. The taxi quickly disappeared. Wenfeng Lin turned and walked back to the O residence. He pressed the doorbell, but it took a long time for the person inside to open the door. The person who opened the door was Xiao Ziqing. Her eyes were red, and she looked very sad. When she saw Wenfeng Lin, she started yelling, You said that Lily was a good child. Do you know what that woman did? She hit my son. She made my son's face bleed. You, an old must be blind. This kind of woman, sob. He couldn't continue and said, We must hurry and persuade Xiao to go to the hospital. He lost so much blood. I hope he doesn't get sick from the beating. She quickly led Wenfeng Lin up to the second floor. When they got there, they realized that the door was locked from the inside. Xiao Ziqing knocked on the door, but there was no response. Inside, Ming was lying on the bed. Wujin was looking at him from the side. His gaze was deep. His eyes were the same as Ming's, and they carried a penetrating sharpness. He looked at his son on the bed and said meaningfully, You've grown up. There are many things that parents shouldn't interfere with, but what you did today was too much. You were the one who provoked her, and now you're the one who insulted her. Why did you do that? Ming didn't open his eyes when he heard that. In a muffled voice, he said, You don't like her, do you? Now that I've broken up with her, shouldn't you be happy? That's the only reason? I thought you said that to chase her away because you didn't want to hold up this child's future. When Hujin said that, he kept his eyes on Ming. Indeed, when he saw Ming's desolate expression, he knew he was right. The child's temperament was like his. Hujin had probably thought it through. However, even if it was him, it was impossible for him to say such hurtful words. Just as Lily had said, it would be difficult to salvage the situation in the future. This child really didn't leave any way out for himself. You'll regret it, Hujin said bluntly. When Ming heard that, the regret in his heart had already swept over the sky and the earth. Yes, he would regret it. Ming was already very, very regretful. But could he regret it? Was there any room for regret now? Lily was still young, only 25 years old. Such a good girl shouldn't spend the rest of her life on a cripple. Even Ming himself couldn't see a future for him. He couldn't afford to gamble. His head was getting dizzier and dizzy. He felt as if his head was being crushed by something, and his cheeks were hot. But Ming didn't dare say it out loud. If he complained that he wasn't feeling well, Xiao Ziqing wouldn't let Lily off. But now, Ming couldn't help it. His head hurt, and gradually, everything around him seemed to be getting further and further away. Lily took old Mrs. Shin out for dinner. When they returned to the hotel, they saw Shan Julia sitting on the sofa eating beef noodles with a resentful look on his face. When he saw them coming up, he glared at Lily and then continued to eat. He said with jealousy and hatred, You two went out to play without me. You are so mean. Chapter 1171. When Shun Julia heard that, he turned his head away with his bowl of beef noodles in his hands. After Lily sat in the hotel for a while, Shun Julia suggested taking old Mrs. Shun to the nearby park and plaza that were very Kingstown style. As the host, Lily naturally introduced them to a lot of local customs and stories. After walking around, it was not until 2 in the afternoon that everyone felt hungry. After finding a place to eat, they played for the rest of the afternoon. It was not until dark that they returned to the hotel to rest. After dinner, Lily said she had to work and went home after saying goodbye to old Mrs. Shun. Lily took out the key and opened the door. When she entered and saw the familiar furnishings, her originally tense mood suddenly relaxed. Home. Finally home. Although there was no so-called family or relatives in this home, it was the only place in the world where she could find a sense of security. It was good to be back. Lily found herself a set of pajamas and then went into the bathroom. When the hot water sprinkled down from the top of her head, Lily's body relaxed even more. After taking a shower and washing her clothes, Lily applied a facial mask that she was usually reluctant to use. After sticking it on her face, she turned on the digital screen and held a pen to find a way to draw. As she drew, half an hour passed without her knowing it. It was not until the phone alarm rang that Lily suddenly woke up. It was already 10 o'clock in the evening. It was time to sleep. Lily washed off the mask, then turned off the digital screen and lay on the bed. However, she was not sleepy at all. For the whole day, she felt as if something was hanging in her heart. It was like there was a dry fountain in the middle of an empty square. However, all of a sudden, the water at the bottom of the dried-up fountain suddenly gushed out continuously. Late at night, it was as cold as water. The loneliness buried in the deepest part of the human heart was always the easiest to quietly overflow in the middle of the night when one was alone and silently penetrate into every cell of one's body. Meticulous turbulence was pervasive. Sorrow seeped into the heart and grew clusters of flowers, brightly facing all life. But in fact, no one could know that, in fact, watering this brilliance was actually fragile loneliness. One day, this loneliness would no longer be able to support this brilliance, and it would slowly rot from its roots. Then it would fall inch by inch, and it would no longer be the same as before. If you don't want me, I'll kill you and then kill myself. Tears fell silently from the corner of her eyes. Lily looked at the ceiling with a calm heart. However, there was an inexplicable sourness and pain. It was just a joke. How could she bear to kill him? There was no way she could do it. It was as if there was a blunt awl hammering deep into his heart, causing him a dull pain. Lily turned over and covered her face with the quilt. The hot and humid feeling quickly covered her face. Breathing became more and more difficult, and Lily was unwilling to raise her head. Her throat became more and more stuffy, and the hot and humid feeling stuck to her face and the quilt. In the end, he couldn't help but raise his head abruptly. Fresh air entered his nose, and the cool air made him feel refreshed. Lily was breathing heavily. She didn't know if it was because of suffocation or something else, but her vision was blurred. He couldn't see anything. Chapter 1172. It was quiet all around. Only the sound of the heartbeat machine could be heard. After some time, there was a commotion all around. Oming frowned. The white light from his glasses stung his eyes. If he doesn't get better, it's hard to say when he will get better, but this situation is not uncommon. He may get better in a few days, or he may not get better for the rest of his life. You family members have to do a good job of counseling the patient. Oming couldn't hear what was said after that. He fell into a deep sleep. When he woke up again, it was still dark. Beep, beep, beep. The heartbeat on the electronic electrocardiogram was steady and rhythmic. Oming's heart suddenly jumped. The electrocardiogram fluctuated, but it quickly returned to normal. Lily was awakened by the doorbell. Lily had no idea when she had fallen asleep the night before. Her phone hadn't been charged the night before. When she went to get it, it was turned off. When she opened the door, it was old Mrs. Shun and Shun Julia. Lily had expected it, so she let them in before going to freshen up. The moment she entered, she realized that her eyes were swollen like two walnuts. Those eyes! I can't even look at them. She quickly applied them. She didn't know if it was a psychological effect, or if she really felt better. She looked left and right and walked out. Shun Julia and old Mrs. Shun acted as if they hadn't seen her. When they saw her, they suggested, "Lily, there's still a few more days before you start work, right? Do you want to go out with Grandma?" Go out with old Mrs. Shun? Lily didn't think it was appropriate, but when she saw the old lady's expectant gaze, she asked, "Where? How about Fujian? I heard that there are a lot of interesting places in Fujian. Moreover, there are many beautiful women there." Let's ask the youngest to drive us there. Anyway, Kingstown is not far from there. We can chat while taking the car there. We can also find a place with beautiful scenery to have a picnic. What do you think? Old Mrs. Shun's eyes were filled with anticipation. I checked. It's only a few hours from Kingstown to Shaman, and the scenery along the way is great. Lily looked at her expectant eyes and shook her head. Forget it, Grandma. You should go with Shun Julia. I haven't been in a good mood recently. I'm not in the mood to go out. Old Mrs. Shun refused to give up and said, Lily, it's precisely because you're in a bad mood that you want to go out and find a way to relax your soul. Isn't that right? Yes. Shun Julia immediately responded with a serious look on his face. Let's go together. It's rare for Grandma to come out. No matter how I asked her to come out in the past, she was always at home and didn't even bother to move. This is also the first time for me to come out with Grandma. Let's go. Shun Julia's gaze was sincere, and his eyes were bright and full of expression. It was as if he could see right into her heart. She shook her head and said, No, Shun Julia, you can go with Grandma. I went to Paris some time ago. I was too busy having fun and didn't have time to finish the draft. Now I have to finish the draft. You can go by yourselves. Shun Julia nodded and said, No, thanks. After that, no matter how much old Mrs. Shun and Shun Julia tried to persuade her, Lily refused to budge. She was indeed in a very bad mood. Lily had never imagined that in the short span of 2 days, her life would change so drastically. Chapter 1173. After treating old Mrs. Shun and Shun Julia to dinner, Lily found an excuse to return home. What she didn't expect was that just as she walked to the entrance of the community, she saw a familiar figure appear at the entrance of the community. Wen Fenglin stepped out of the taxi. In his hand was a simple handbag. In the palm of his hand was a cell phone. It looked like he was calling someone. When Lily saw Wen Fenglin, she was shocked. What is this person doing here? Is he looking for someone? Does he know someone who lives nearby? Or does he live in this neighborhood? Just as Lily was wondering about this, the cell phone in her pocket began to vibrate. She took a look and saw that the name on the screen was Uncle Wen. Lily answered the call and placed it to her ear. Uncle Wen, lass, where are you? Wen Fenglin asked. Lily took 2 steps forward to the entrance of the neighborhood and replied, I'm here. When Wen Fenglin heard Lily's voice, he turned his head and looked over. When he saw Lily on the phone, he chuckled. 2 dimples appeared on his cheeks, making him look exceptionally good-looking. Lily hung up the phone at the same time. She looked at Wen Fenglin with some doubt and apprehension in her heart. Wen Fenglin and Xiao Ziqing are good friends. Is he helping Xiao Ziqing to cause trouble for me? As if he could sense Lily's uneasiness, the smile on Wen Fenglin's face widened. Beneath his black-rimmed glasses, his small eyes narrowed as he asked, Is there a place nearby for us to sit? He had asked to sit nearby, not at Lily's house. The subtle details made Lily's heart relax a little. She nodded her head and replied, Yes. She brought Wen Fenglin to a nearby cafe. Because of the Spring Festival, it was usually a busy time, but there weren't that many people there. Lily chose a quiet corner. They each ordered a drink and sat facing each other. Lily waited for him to speak first. Wen Fenglin looked at Lily and said, I heard that you beat up Ming yesterday. You were pretty vicious. He was knocked unconscious. Lily was stunned. She looked at Wen Fenglin and tried to find a hint of a joke on his face. But he didn't. It can't be. Ming is unconscious? Lily's heart was beating wildly. Wen Fenglin nodded his head and replied, Ming's mother is very upset. I think it's best that you go visit Ming. He's not in a good state right now. If you can stay by his side, his condition should improve. After all, to Ming, Lily's status was very, very special. Just like how he was like Xian'er in the past. Wen Fenglin believed that their relationship was deeper than his and Xian'er's. Lily's hands were under the table, and her palms were tightly twisted together. At this moment, it was as if a raging fire had been set ablaze in her heart, causing all the determination in her heart to vanish in an instant. Shall we go and see him? He didn't seem to be in a good state. Uncle Wen's words could be trusted. Lily almost swayed, but then she remembered what Ming had said to her yesterday. Chapter 1174. Is his condition that bad? The words from the day before were still ringing in her head. Her mind was a mess. She was caught in a dilemma. Oming's condition isn't good. Is he still unconscious? Judging from Uncle Wen's expression, he doesn't seem to be anxious or nervous. That can't be true, can it? Wen Fenglin looked at her intently and nodded his head. Not very well. He's been unconscious since yesterday. The doctor said that once he wakes up, the condition of his eyes might worsen. In other words, it was very likely that Ming would never see again. Lily suddenly felt a warm current rush through her. She couldn't stop the tears from welling up in her eyes. When she felt Wen Fenglin's meaningful gaze, Lily felt like he was a prison warden judging a prisoner. Looking at her with such a gaze made her feel very uncomfortable. Lily thought about it and smiled. In a low voice, she said, "Uncle Wen, Ming is blessed by heaven. He'll definitely recover." "I hope so. I also hope that he will recover soon. After all, Ming calls me uncle. Given his current condition, I'm worried for him." Wen Fenglin looked at Lily and continued, "The reason why I came to look for you is that I hope that Ming will regain consciousness sooner. To be honest, Ming's mother didn't allow me to look for you. She feels that you're the one who caused her son to become like this. The 2 slaps you gave him yesterday only worsen his injuries." Without a doubt, Xiao Ziqing must hate Lily very much. Lily knew that very well. She smiled and said, "Uncle Wen, you weren't around yesterday. You might not have understood what he said to me yesterday. I'll remember what Ming said yesterday. If anything happens to Ming in the future, I hope that you won't tell me. It's none of my business." Furthermore, she was afraid that after hearing about Ming's condition, her heart would soften and she wouldn't be able to control herself. "You won't be able to let it go." Wen Fenglin's words hit the nail on the head. He looked at Lily with a smile on his face. "This child of yours is very similar to someone I used to know. Is that why he's treating me so well?" Lily seemed to understand something, but she didn't say a word. The drink that she had ordered was served. Lily didn't touch it. She looked at Wen Fenglin and stood up. "Uncle Wen, thank you for coming to tell me today, but I won't be going. I have something to do. I'll head back first." As he spoke, he was already walking out of his seat. His heart felt like it was being clenched tightly. Wen Fenglin looked at Lily in astonishment. Before coming, Wen Fenglin had thought of countless possibilities, but he hadn't expected Lily to reject him outright. Lily's attitude was beyond Wen Fenglin's expectations. What Wen Fenglin hadn't expected was that Lily's actions would earn him a sense of admiration. When he realized this, Wen Fenglin laughed bitterly to himself. Wen said. Wen. "Little boy, it's not that I don't want to help you. It's just that you've crossed the line," Wen Fenglin muttered to himself. One of a, one, you. Chapter 1175. Lily was a little embarrassed. She cleared her throat and said, "I haven't finished drawing yet. It's almost time for the update. If I don't rush the draft, I'm afraid the readers will scold me." "You draw as well?" Wen Fenglin was a little surprised. This was the first time he had heard of Lily's occupation. Lily was even more embarrassed. She cleared her throat and tried to act natural, but she couldn't stop her face from heating up. She nodded her head and said, "The nature of my drawing is different from yours. I serialize my comics online. Impressive." Wen Fenglin's eyes lit up. "Can I take a look at your comics?" Lily was even more embarrassed. "I draw shoujo comics. I can't show them to you. That's all right. Comics are also a form of art. They have a story and are readable. They're much better than antiques like us," Wen Fenglin said with a smile. He immediately changed the topic. "It's fine if you really can't do it. I'm just a little curious." Oops, Lily had a good impression of Wen Fenglin. Since the elders had already spoken so clearly, it wouldn't be right for her to turn them down again. She thought about it and took out her phone. She opened the Eurasian Comics app and found her work. She opened it and said, "This is what I drew." Wen Fenglin took it from her and flipped through it a few times. Lily couldn't see Wen Fenglin's expression. She stood there awkwardly. This was the first time someone she knew had asked her about her work. It was also the first time someone she knew was looking at her comics. Lily had a strange feeling about it. Lily's hair stood on end. She asked, "Isn't it a little childish?" "No, it's very well drawn." When Lin looked at the drawing style, "It's different from the comics I've seen in the past. Yours is more realistic. Why does this male lead look so familiar?" The male lead in the drawing was wearing a burgundy suit. His short black hair was the most popular hairstyle of the day. The male lead on the screen was holding a champagne glass. He was squinting his eyes and looking ahead. His features were well defined, and he looked very handsome. However, compared to other comics, Lily's drawing was more realistic. The character in the painting was based on Ming, so of course he looked familiar. Lily laughed dryly. Just as she was about to say something, she realized that when Lin had flipped to the page and looked at the title, Love Transaction, the main storyline of the comic was based on Lily's own life. When the title was read, Lily's heart skipped a beat. She quickly snatched her phone back. When she met Lin's gaze, she felt a little uneasy. When Lin merely smiled and replied, "I've seen this comic before. It's ranked at the top of the national comic rankings. It's very popular. Someone introduced this comic to me in the hopes that I would give it a chance to promote it. I haven't had the time to check it out." "I didn't expect the artist to be you." Lily was stunned. She was secretly shocked by Lin's words. So, the Eurasian comic had actually gotten Lin to recommend it? Lin's reputation in the country was not to be underestimated. If Lin was the one to promote her, the effect would be. Chapter 1176. Cross-border publicity was bound to have an unimaginable effect on comics. But for the artist himself, there was no benefit. Moreover, such a thing was also a thankless task for the Eurasian comics. The only people who would benefit from it would be the comics and the artist. The more Lily thought about it, the more she realized something. It was Ming. Eurasian Comics was his company. He must have known about her work and her career. Ming must have gotten his men to help her with the publicity. That way, once Lily's reputation was established, her future would be smooth sailing. But something like this had happened to Ming. Wait a minute. If Ming was willing to do that for me, then he must be serious about me, right? Lily didn't believe that it was simply because I was his girlfriend or a mistress. If he was sincere, then why did he say those things the day before? It wasn't just the day before. It was the last time, and the time before that. Lily felt that she didn't understand him. In other words, she had never understood this man before. This man's mood swings were unpredictable. All along, he had been overbearing and arrogant. He never explained what he was thinking, and no one could understand him. "Uncle One, when did I get you to do the publicity for me?" "Probably last month. I was in Fujian at the time, and the people from Eurasian Comics came to talk to me." Lily nodded her head. The fire that had been burning in her heart slowly died down. Times had changed. The Ming now was no longer the Ming of last month. Lily smiled at Lin and nodded her head. "I see. Uncle Wen, please sit here for a while. I'll go up to rush the draft. A serialized drawing can't be delayed for too long. Otherwise, it'll lose popularity." "All right, go ahead." When Lin nodded his head, Lily turned around and left. When Lily got home, she held the stylus for a long time. Her mind was a mess. Sometimes it was Lin's words, and sometimes it was old Mrs. Shun's. Sometimes it was Ming's and Xiao Ziqing's voices. Frustration. Ming isn't in a good state. Not in a good state? How bad is that? The people from Eurasian Comics came to me to talk to me. It was hard to estimate the amount of funds and costs required to hire such an artist for publicity. Such a man who treated her like this. Lily's hand holding the pen slightly shrank, and she imagined Ming's current posture. What did he look like now? Suddenly, his cell phone rang. The sudden tremor made Lily's heart skip a beat. The stylus fell to the ground with a clatter. The caller ID showed old Madam Shun. After Lily calmed down a little, she answered the phone. Old Mrs. Shun was just bored, so she called the nag. Lily chatted with her for a while before hanging up. However, after hanging up the phone, the desire to see Ming in her heart became even stronger. She wanted to see him, to see him. She wanted to see him. Breaking up to fall again. Chapter 1177. Coincidentally, when Feng Lin had a few documents and other matters to attend to, he sat in the shop for a while. When he was done, he stood up to leave. As soon as he stepped out of the shop, he saw Lily standing at the entrance of the estate, waiting for a taxi. A taxi was coming her way. Lily quickly stopped it and got in. When Feng Lin looked at her and knew where she was going. Watching the taxi from afar, when Feng Lin couldn't help but laugh. What a hypocrite. She was just like her. Feng Lin's eyes darkened as he thought of the woman in his memories. By the time Lily reached the hospital in a taxi, it was already half an hour later. On the 5th day of the Lunar New Year, there were fewer people at the hospital than usual. Ming was considered half a public figure. If she asked directly, the receptionist wouldn't tell her where Ming was. Lily went in and walked to the VIP ward area with ease. The family had a habit, nostalgia. They would probably still be staying in room V8. As Lily walked in that direction, she decided to take a gamble. She didn't expect to see Ming's ward when she got closer. However, as soon as he got closer, he heard voices coming from inside. That woman is so evil. Not only did she hurt you like this, she even hit you yesterday. Xiao Ziqing's voice was sobbing. She sounded sad and full of hatred. Xiao Ziqing had never had a good impression of Lily, especially after Lily had hit her son the day before. Xiao Ziqing felt that the woman was despicable. She has ulterior motives and deserves to be punished. When Lily heard Xiao Ziqing's voice from outside, she stopped in her tracks and stood at the door. Ming didn't say a word. Xiao Ziqing continued, I don't care if what you said yesterday was true or false. Since you broke up with her, it's best if you don't contact her again. I've already listened to you and blacklisted her number on your phone. I've also deleted the speed dial. From now on, just pretend that this woman never appeared. I've already listened to you. Did Ming ask Xiao Ziqing to do that? It turned out that Ming was not only like this in front of her, but also in front of his mother. A blind person who couldn't see anything let others put her number into the blacklist. In that case, she would never be able to contact him again. It was impossible for a blind person to pull her number out of the blacklist. As for the others, it was even more impossible for them to help him pull it out. Lily stood at the door and felt like a fool. Lily's heart ached, and her original idea of going and disappeared. She didn't want to go in anymore. However, at the same time as she turned around, a low voice came from inside. It was muffled, but it seemed to reach in her heart. Yes, it was Ming. Lily's heart was like a wisp of dry straw floating on a charcoal fire. When it came into contact with the fire, it instantly burned into ashes and scattered. It seemed that Xiao Ziqing really hated him. Since ancient times, it was impossible to be loyal and filial at the same time. Chapter 1178. At that moment, she felt like a drowning dog. She couldn't describe how miserable she was. She wasn't in front of them, but the feeling was as strong as ever. She walked away faster and faster. She lowered her head and didn't even dare to look back. She walked away quickly. In the ward, Xiao Ziqing was surprised by Ming's answer. She asked, Really? You promised me? Ming's eyes were empty, and he looked ahead without any focus. At first glance, they looked like the eyes of those imitation dolls. You're my mother. I'll do whatever you say. Anyway, I don't have the slightest choice in front of you, do I? Ming stared blankly ahead, and a bitter smile hung on his lips. He looked a little helpless, but at the same time, everyone could clearly feel that he was sad. Xiao Ziqing was taken aback when she heard this. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. After a moment of silence, Xiao Ziqing asked, Are you still blaming me? You're my mother. I dare not blame you, Ming said. However, when these words were heard by others, it was even more chilling. Xiao Ziqing's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Ming and said earnestly, Mom is doing this for your own good. What's so good about that woman? Why do you insist on having her? Do you want her to kill you before you can give up? You're my son. I will never harm you. Yes, it was all for his own good. She was his mother. How could she deliberately harm him? But it was this kind of love and kindness that made his head hurt. They were all doing this for his own good. Why should he not listen? They were all doing this for his own good. so his own choice would also be completely taken away, not even leaving a single shred of it. Everything was for the sake of that honorable banner. It was for his own good. The bitter smile on Ming's face widened, and he said, I know. Anyway, I'm blind now, and I don't want to hold her back. It's good to let her go. If we break up, she can find someone better. There is more than one man in the world. But in this world, there was only one Lily. Ming lay down, pulled up the quilt, and lay on his side. When Xiao Ziqing heard this, she felt that Ming was even more stubborn. Looking at Ming lying on the bed, she was so angry that she stomped her feet. At the same time, she was so distressed that she didn't know what to say. Looking at her son for a long time, Xiao Ziqing actually didn't know whether what she was doing was right or wrong. Xiao Ziqing stood in place for a long time before she finally gritted her teeth and said, One day, you'll understand my good intentions. You're not the only man in this world, but you're my only son. I can't let her kill you. This woman was not a kind person. She had evil intentions. After Xiao Ziqing finished speaking, she was even more certain of her thoughts. She stomped her feet, turned around, and left. Ming listened as the footsteps faded away and opened his eyes. In front of him, it was as if Lily, dressed in red and smiling like a flower, appeared. Today was the 5th day of the Lunar New Year. 25 years ago today, Kingstown welcomed its rare winter. 25 years ago, it was snowing in Kingstown, a rare occurrence in 100 years. The kind director of the orphanage saved a newborn baby girl and named her Lily. Chapter 1179. Lily walked like a zombie. When she took a taxi home, she was called out by the taxi driver. She paid the fare and went upstairs. When she got out of the elevator, she started to look for the key. She had only been away for a day, but she was very attached to this place. It was just a shared house, but it was the only place in the world that she could call home. She entered the password and took out the key to open the door. It was dark inside. Lily followed her memory and touched the switch. When she was about to open it, there was a sudden movement inside. The sound of high heels came from inside, and Lily's heart was alarmed, but at the same time, full of surprise, and a familiar voice suddenly shouted, Surprise! A few familiar voices mixed together, sounding very excited. Among them, the most excited voice was undoubtedly old Mrs. Shun. The chandelier in the living room was turned on, and there were many balloons in the living room. Everyone was wearing a hat on their head. It looked very lovely and festive. Old Mrs. Shun walked toward Lily with a heart-shaped balloon in her hands and shouted, Lily, why are you back so soon? We are not fully prepared. Lily was stunned when she saw the scene. In front of her, not only was old Mrs. Shun, but also Shun Julia, Yi Qian, Yi Yu, and a few colleagues who were good friends with her in the company. They were all here? Don't you go to work on the 8th day of the new year? Today is only the 5th. Lily's first reaction was to blurt out. Yi Qian and a few colleagues came forward and helped her sit on the sofa. Yi Qian said, Yes, but I came back early. Today is your birthday. We discussed it a long time ago to give you a surprise. How is it? Are you surprised by your sister's surprise? Lily looked at them in a daze. Everything around her, including the big cake box on the coffee table, and the colleagues and friends around her, all looked very happy. His originally ice-cold heart felt as if it had been injected with a warm current in an instant. Lily looked at Yi Qian's big smile in front of her, and tears welled up in her eyes. Very quickly, she held back the tears and smiled at them with a big smile. Didn't I waste your vacation? I won't compensate you for your losses. Yi Qian took out a hat and put it on her head. She glared at her and said, If you don't compensate me, I'm still hoping that you'll take us on a vacation. You want to travel? Yeah, I heard all about it. Did you really break up with Ming? Yi Qian leaned over and whispered. Lily was stunned when she heard that. When Yi Qian saw the expression on Lily's face, she knew she was right. Before Lily could react, she immediately said, Well done. You shouldn't miss something like that. Look at Shun Jilia. He's handsome, rich, and a psychiatrist. His mental fortitude is impeccable. Why would he give up a field of flowers for a pile of cow dung? Lily's eyes widened. Yi Qianqian's metaphor was not polite at all. Lily's lips twitched. This was the first time she had heard someone compare Ming to cow dung. Chapter 1180. In front of her, Shunjulia's bright smile appeared and waved at Lily. Lily glanced at him and was speechless. She turned back and said, "Don't pick the wildflowers on the side of the road." Yi Qianqian burst out laughing, and Shunjulia's face fell. He said with some resentment, "How did I become a wildflower? I'm better than many people." "That's right. You're much better than your previous ex-boyfriend." Yi Qianqian snorted. Thinking of the last time she was drunk and lying in the living room all night, she wanted to slap that man. What kind of man is he? He doesn't care about women at all. Doesn't he know how to cherish women? Doesn't he know how to help women back to their rooms? It wasn't easy for her to lie on the cold floor all night. Although the other two colleagues didn't know what kind of person Ming was, Shunjulia was indeed very good. Hearing Yi Qianqian's words, they immediately seconded. "That's right, Lily. Shun is a good person. He is handsome and has good qualifications. What do you want? What does your ex-boyfriend look like? Do you have a picture? His qualifications are definitely not as good as Shun's, right?" Shunjulia was from the capital. If Lily married Shunjulia, she would definitely become a resident of the capital. Such a thing would start to change fundamentally. If such a good thing happened to them, they would definitely agree without hesitation. Maybe they would force themselves on her, and then the rice would be cooked. Then, wouldn't it be natural for them to marry him and become a resident of the capital? Although the local residents of Kingstown were also very good, they were still inferior to those in the capital. Lily knew what they were thinking, so she decided to ignore them. Shunjulia quickly said, "Since Lily is back, let's do it this way. There's no need to prepare anything else. Just sit down." That manner, that posture, impressively, was like that of a male master. Yi Qianqian couldn't help but look at Shunjulia and secretly gave him a thumbs up. "Good guy, he's so thick-skinned. I like it." Shunjulia pretended not to see Yi Qianqian's eyes and asked the other two colleagues to sit down. Then he opened the cake box. The cake was huge, huge, huge. Old Mrs. Shun's eyes lit up as she looked at the huge cake. When Lily saw the cake, she was even more stunned. It was a strawberry cake. The whole cake was densely covered with strawberries. Apart from the strawberries, there were also chocolate decorations. It looked very fragrant, very delicious. Shunjulia began to insert and light the candles. There were exactly 25 of them. It seemed that every year on her birthday, the people around her would change. But none of those years had given her such a warm and pleasant surprise. Even Ming hadn't given her such a feeling. After Shunjulia lit the candles, everyone urged Lily to make a wish. Lily chuckled, closed her eyes, put her palms together, and said, "I hope so many people will celebrate my birthday with me every year." Old Mrs. Shun's heart ached when she heard that, and so did Yi Qianqian. However, she immediately put on a straight face and said, "It won't come true if you say it out loud. Say it again in your heart. Say it differently." Hearing that, Lily's eyes curved. Chapter 1181. After blowing out the candles, Lily picked up a plastic knife and started cutting the cake. The cake was too big and thick, and Lily's hands weren't strong enough. She only messed up the cake after a long time. Shunjulia couldn't stand it anymore. He went behind Lily and reached out to hold her hand. Lily was so focused on the cake in front of her that she didn't expect Shunjulia to suddenly make such a move. She could clearly feel the warmth of the man behind her. Shunjulia's warm breath was beside her ear. His actions were ambiguous. Everyone stared at him. The other two female colleagues wanted to make a fuss, but when they saw Shunjulia's calm expression, they thought they were overthinking it. However, Lily, who was the person in question, was obviously shocked and stunned. Before she could turn her head, she felt Shunjulia's hand tighten slightly. He held her hand and cut it off. After cutting the cake, Shunjulia immediately let go of her hand. "Happy birthday!" Yi Qianqian took the lead and shouted. Seeing Lily's slightly shocked expression, everyone tacitly didn't mention it. Lily looked back at Shunjulia and found that he wasn't looking at her. Instead, he took out the disposable plate of the cake and divided it up. Seeing that, Lily lowered her head to cut the cake. When she was halfway through, Shun Juliet came forward and snatched the knife away. He said, "You're so slow. Let me do it." This scene was witnessed by all the women. When old Mrs. Shun saw it, she had a new understanding of her grandson's tricks and tricks. She secretly gave Shun Juliet a look of approval. Then, she turned her head and continued to play dumb. After everyone finished eating the cake, their stomachs were almost full. Their original plan to go out for supper had to be canceled. Yi Qianqian took out a deck of cards from somewhere, and the four of them played together. Old Mrs. Shun was getting on in years, and she woke up early in the morning. After eating the cake, she felt a little tired. She watched a group of young people play on the sofa and fell asleep before she knew it. Old Mrs. Shun sat behind Shun Juliet, and Lily sat across from them. Seeing the old lady like that, Lily asked Shun Juliet to take the old lady back first. However, the old lady wouldn't wake up no matter how hard she tried. Lily had no choice but to let Shun Juliet carry the old lady to sleep in her room. After the few of them finished playing cards, they went their separate ways to chat. At the end of the conversation, everyone was thinking about how they should spend the next 2 days of vacation. There was no conclusion to the discussion. The two colleagues felt bored, so they left first. Not long after the two colleagues left, Shun Juliet suddenly looked up and said, "Why don't we go on a trip?" Hearing this, Yi Qianqian suddenly became excited. She looked at Shun Juliet in front of her, and her eyes lit up. She asked, "Where are we going for a vacation?" "Let's go to Fujian. I heard it's very beautiful there." Shun Juliet's words were directed at Yi Qianqian, but his eyes were looking at Lily. "My grandmother also wants to go, but because you're not going, she doesn't want to go either. It's rare that grandmother is in the mood to travel. Why don't you come along?" Although old Mrs. Shun was old, she was playful and even a little childish. Chapter 1182. Lily had clearly rejected the idea that day, but Shun Juliet had brought it up again. Lily could tell that old Mrs. Shun really wanted to go. Most importantly, Yi Qianqian looked like she really wanted to go too. A vacation, it was good to relax. Lily thought about it and quickly nodded her head. Shun Juliet smiled and looked at Lily with a burning gaze. He nodded his head and said, "All right, let's go." That night, old Mrs. Shun and Lily slept together, and Shun Juliet returned to the hotel. The next morning, at 7 or 8 o'clock, Shun Juliet rang the doorbell. What surprised Yi Qianqian and Lily the most was that he had everything prepared. A car for the trip, snacks to eat, and a hotel reservation had been made. Lily, Yi Qianqian, and old Mrs. Shun only had to pack a change of clothes before they set off. Kingstown wasn't far from Fujian, but it was a 3 to 4 hour drive. Along the way, they chatted and laughed, and time passed quickly. Very soon, the local scenery was revealed. The spring-like scenery was breathtakingly beautiful. When they reached the hotel, it was past 1 in the afternoon. After dinner, they went to the nearby scenic spots. "What great place!" Lily couldn't help but exclaim as she stood by the clear lake. At a glance, the mountains were foggy, and the sounds of birds chirping and wings flapping could be heard. The surface of the water was sparkling, and the sound of gurgling was endless. The air was fresh, and the sun shone down, making the place look like a fairyland. "Beautiful. It's even more beautiful when the sun rises," old Mrs. Shun said with a smile as she stood behind Lily. Lily looked at the old lady, and the old lady looked back at her. That pair of slightly turbid old eyes looked very bright at this moment. Lily saw her own reflection in the old lady's eyes. Old Mrs. Shun's eyes reddened, and she lamented, "It's not easy to be able to stand here with you. Did you know, Lily? You actually look like the daughter of a friend of mine." Lily looked at old Mrs. Shun and waited for her to continue. Old Mrs. Shun changed the topic and didn't continue. Instead, she asked, "How did you meet Wenfenglin?" Lily thought for a moment and carefully chose her words. Then, she told him everything in detail. In the end, she added, "Uncle Wen is a very good person. He treats me very well." Old Mrs. Shun had a look of understanding on her face as she said, "Wenfenglin is a good man, but I'm guessing that the reason he treats you so well is because he can tell that you resemble that old friend of his. Sienna? Lily asked tentatively. How did you know? I heard Uncle One and Ming's mother mention it. Chapter 1183. Old Mrs. Shun wanted to say something, but stopped herself. She shook her head and said, It's such a pity for such a good girl. Her health has been poor since she was young. She has kidney problems and heart problems. It's impossible for her to marry, let alone be with a man. Lily was an adult. She knew what old Mrs. Shun meant. She couldn't be with a man. If what old Mrs. Shun said was true, then given Wen Fengling's personality, he would never do anything with Xian Er. If it weren't for that, I would have suspected that you were Xian Er's daughter. Old Mrs. Shun smiled. Her eyes were filled with kindness. Do I look like her? Old Mrs. Shun shook her head and said, You don't look alike, but your charm is similar. As she spoke, she walked to Lily's side and said, Especially this side of your face. You look very much like Xian Er, except that Xian Er is fairer than you. It's not your healthy skin tone, but the pale kind of white. Lily could imagine what that must have been like. Old Mrs. Shun frowned as she looked Lily up and down. She rubbed her chin and muttered, From the side, you look a little alike. But, upon closer inspection, you look healthier and more delicate than Xian Er. You're more exquisite, and your features aren't alike either. There was an indescribable feeling that people couldn't help but pull her towards Xian Er. It was a familiar feeling. They didn't look alike in any way, but the more they spent time together, the stronger the feeling became. Old Mrs. Shun gestured and shook her head. Nope. Lily was amused by the old lady's expression. Looking at old Mrs. Shun, the feeling of familiarity in her heart grew stronger. How nice it would be if she was really my grandmother. With that thought in mind, Lily's expression softened a little. The afterglow of the setting sun shone from afar. The orange-red sunset reflected off the surface of the lake. The sunlight pierced through the clouds and bathed everyone's hair and body in an orange-red hue. It was beautiful and dazzling. Shun Julia stood not far behind and watched Lily in the distance. His lips curled into a smile, and his gaze softened. Yi Qian squatted by the bridge and looked at Shun Julia's unwavering gaze. She pouted her lips, picked up a stone, and threw it into the lake. Let's go somewhere else to play, Grandma. Lily took old Mrs. Shun's hand. When she turned around, she met Shun Julia's gaze. But very quickly, Shun Julia's gaze shifted away. It was as if he had inadvertently turned his head to look at her without leaving a trace. Lily didn't care. She took the old lady's hand and walked toward the exit. He didn't notice the strange look in Yi Qian's eyes behind him. After playing for a while, they ate something together and then returned to the hotel together. Lily and Yi Qian were both girls, so they booked a room for themselves. Old Mrs. Han and Shun Julia each had a room. Lily asked Yi Qian to take a shower first. She sat on the bed with her phone in her hand and scrolled through Weibo. Just as he was laughing so hard while watching a short video, a phone call interrupted the video. An unknown number called, and the caller ID was the city she was currently in. Who could it be? Lily's first thought was that it was a prank call. The phone rang a few times, but the caller didn't hang up. She picked it up. Hello. Chapter 1184. Police station. Boyfriend? My boyfriend is at the police station? What the hell? Where did my boyfriend come from? Why is he at the police station? Lily was confused and asked, Mr. Policeman, are you mistaken? I don't have a boyfriend. You don't have a boyfriend, but this gentleman said he was your boyfriend and gave us your phone number for us to call. The policeman's voice was a little loud and not very friendly. Miss, no matter what you quarreled with, you shouldn't have left a blind man on the road. It's so dangerous. Fortunately, he knew to come to the police station for help. He doesn't have a guide cane or a guide dog. If he was hit by a car on the road, you'd be in deep trouble. A blind man? Ming? Lily couldn't believe it and asked, Mr. Policeman, what's the name of the man who claimed to be my boyfriend? I think his surname is O. The policeman's voice was obviously a little farther away. I'm talking to your girlfriend on the phone. What's your name? After a while, the man on the other side of the phone said, He said his name is Ming. Lily had guessed many times, and every guess was Ming. But when she heard Ming's name, Lily was still shocked. Ming? Is it really Ming? Is it really Ming? Lily couldn't believe it and said, "Can you ask him to answer the phone?" Just a moment. The man on the other side of the phone seemed to be communicating, but Lily had already sat up. At that moment, her heart was still full of disbelief. Taking advantage of this gap, Lily put the phone on speaker and then went to Baidu to check the number. As soon as the number was dialed, it immediately showed the address of the local police station, as well as the phone number, the director, and the person in charge. Oh my God, it really is the police station. There was a rustling sound on the other side of the phone, and the policeman quickly came over and said, "The gentleman refused to answer the phone. Miss you, please come over. It's so late. Do you have to make a quarrel between lovers so big?" Lily was speechless. A quarrel between lovers really didn't have to be so big. But now the point was that she and Ming were no longer lovers. Not to mention that they weren't lovers. They weren't even friends. Why did she have to pick her up? Girlfriend? "I'm sorry, I do know him, but I'm not his girlfriend. You should ask someone else to pick him up. It's already past 10 o'clock in the evening. The person in charge here is ready to get off work because he has worked overtime for almost half an hour. He doesn't have any money with him now. I heard that in order to find you, he hasn't eaten for a whole day. He can't see and his hand is injured. He looks so pitiful." Lily was silent for a moment, then said, "Mr. Policeman, can you do me a favor and take him to a hotel to stay? I'll transfer the money to your account and let him eat and stay. This is a police station, not a shelter, nor an errand station. I'll send the address to your phone. You can come over now." As he spoke, he actually hung up the phone. Lily felt a headache and sighed with her hand on her forehead. He had no choice but to put on his shoes and coat, then took a taxi to the police station. When she got out of the car, Lily shivered in the cold wind. It was unexpectedly cold today. Chapter 1185. At that moment, Ming was sitting in front of the table. He was wearing a thin jacket with silk pajamas underneath. His hand was in a cast and hung around his neck. He was also wearing thin silk pajama pants. The dark purple satin glowed faintly under the fluorescent light. He looked very noble, and one could tell at a glance that he was very expensive. However, he was only wearing a pair of ordinary cotton shoes. He looked a little down and out, a little ragged. What made her heart ache was Ming's eyes. They were supposed to be bright and bright, but at that moment, they were empty and unfocused. They were like the eyes of a rag doll. Without a soul, they were gray and dark. Lily's footsteps slowed down as she walked inside. Seeing Ming like that made her heart ache. She was clearly in front of him, but he couldn't see her. But why is he here? Shouldn't he be in Kingstown at this time? And shouldn't he be in the hospital at this time? What is going on? There were policemen chatting inside. When they saw Lily come in, one of them immediately lit up and shouted, "Miss you, are you here to pick up Mr. O?" When he heard the policeman's words, Ming was obviously stunned. He turned his head in Lily's direction and faced her. When Lily heard the policeman's words, she smiled and said, "I am Lily. Please wait a moment." Ming faced the front of Lily and reached his hand out toward her. When Lily saw his hand, she stopped in her tracks. Lily felt a sudden pain in her heart when she saw him reaching out to her so naturally. Ming was expressionless. He didn't say a word, but he easily affected her emotions. This guy is so disgusting. Soon, Lily looked up and automatically ignored his hand. She pretended not to see it and looked at the policeman. "When did he come?" "At 10 o'clock, I think. We saw him wandering on the road, so we brought him back," a policeman said. "It's not that I want to criticize you young people, but how can you let a blind man wander around?" Fortunately, nothing happened. If something happened, who could bear the responsibility? Yes, no one could bear the responsibility. However, such a responsibility should not be borne by her. Lily's gaze finally returned to Ming. She looked at his hand that was still extended toward her and asked, "How did you get here?" Ming didn't say anything. He reached out and grabbed Lily. Lily looked at him and took a step back easily. Then, Ming jumped into the air. Shouldn't you be hospitalized at this time? Did the doctor agree to discharge you? Lily's tone was not very pleasant. She sounded very disgusted. Hearing Lily's tone, the surrounding police officers, who had thought that she would quickly take the man away, looked at each other. However, Ming still did not speak. His rosy lips were pursed into a thin line, and his eyes were empty as he looked ahead. Lily's tone became even worse. As if she had lost her temper, she roared, "Do your parents know that you came from Kingstown?" Still, there was no answer. Ming was like a mute, refusing to say a word. Chapter 1186. He knew that she couldn't just sit back and do nothing. He knew that she couldn't just leave him be. He was the one who broke up with her first. He was the one who chased her away. He was also the one who was afraid that she would covet his family's money. How could he still come to her so naturally? He didn't even change his clothes. He didn't even bring anyone with him. Lily could even tell at a glance that the jacket he was wearing wasn't Ming's at all. He was wearing such a thin set of pajamas, and he was looking for someone. Didn't he feel embarrassed? Didn't he feel embarrassed by his behavior? Lily looked at him with hatred and gritted her teeth. "I'll call your mother and ask her to come pick you up." As she spoke, she picked up her phone and scrolled through her contact list. Who would have thought that Ming would suddenly stand up and accurately slap her cell phone away? The phone fell to the ground. Lily widened her eyes at the man in front of her. She was a little angry. "This is the police station. You're damaging my personal property." As she spoke, she picked up her phone and turned to look at the policeman. "Mr. Policeman, you've seen it for yourself. Please leave him here. I'll call his mother. I'll leave first." But Ming still didn't say a word. He walked forward and reached out with his uninjured hand to grab Lily's hand. Lily was quick to react and quickly dodged. Ming's hand missed and grabbed her down jacket. Just like that, he tugged hard and refused to let go. "Hey, are you crazy? Let go." Lily held the phone in one hand and tried to pull him away with the other, but Ming's strength was surprisingly strong. Lily couldn't move him at all. Lily's anger rose. At that moment, she felt that this man was shameless and unreasonable. She raised her phone and smashed it into his palm. "Let go! Let go! Let go!" Ming's hands, which were already stiff from the cold, immediately turned red after being beaten so many times. No matter how Lily hit him, Ming didn't make sound. "Do you have any shame? How can a man entangle a woman like me? Let go!" Lily couldn't bear it anymore. She roared and hit him harder. Ming. Seeing this, the policeman, who thought it was just a couple quarreling, also felt that something was wrong. They couldn't care less about watching the fun and hurried forward to pull them apart. They warned, "Miss, this is the police station. You can't beat disabled people." Disabled people. These 4 words were even more hurtful. As expected, Lily clearly saw Ming's movements pause. It was obvious that his expression changed slightly. Lily didn't feel happy at all. Instead, she was a little annoyed. She turned her head and glared at the policeman, shouting, "What disabled person? How does such a big man look like a disabled person? You just can't see it for the time being." The policeman was stunned and looked at Lily inexplicably. What was going on? Wasn't he a disabled person? Blind and fractured. However, the policeman immediately caught on to Lily's words and questioned her. "Didn't you say that he wasn't your boyfriend? It seems like your relationship isn't ordinary." When Lily heard that, she was speechless. Chapter 1187. Hearing that, Lily subconsciously looked at Ming's hand that had been beaten by her. Sure enough, the back of Ming's hand was green and red. It was hanging by his side, and his eyes were empty as he stood silently. Lily's heart ached when she saw that. Did I hit him? What a sin. But she immediately realized her subconscious reaction, and her heart immediately suppressed that feeling. Damn it, he was asking for it. Why should I feel sorry for him? Why does anyone feel sorry for me? Hey, it's so late, and the weather is so cold. Don't be awkward. It's not easy for everyone. You quickly take her back and make it convenient for us, the police, okay? One of them said to Lily with a cold breath. Lily nodded. This coat is mine. One of the police officers pointed to Ming's cotton coat. It was very thin. Lily felt even more speechless. He simply signed the papers and reluctantly took the man away. Returning the jacket to the comrade, Lily looked at the dark purple satin pajamas that Ming was wearing. Her brows furrowed. Lily took off her long down jacket and draped it over him without another word. Unexpectedly, Ming reached out and finally said, I'm not cold. You can wear it yourself. Bullsh asterisk T. Lily rolled her eyes at him and slapped his hand away. What nonsense are you talking to me for? F asterisk CK. I'm so unlucky to have met you. What he said, the lips of the police officers behind her twitched, and they were speechless. Lily helped Ming put his shirt on. She let one of his hands go through the sleeves and covered him with the other. Then, she carefully zipped up his shirt and put his hat on. Ming was much taller than Lily. Originally, Lily was wearing a long down jacket that almost reached her ankles, but Ming only wore it to his knees. But this kind of equipment was enough to keep him warm. After checking to make sure it was airtight and warm, Lily took his hand and walked out. The police officers behind her watched and shook their heads. They sighed and said, Women are not to be trifled with. My girlfriend is even more difficult to deal with. This brat is really something. If my girlfriend treated me like this, I would have quit long ago. I can't see, can I? How can I not lower my head when I'm under the eaves? That's true. It's not easy for a blind man to find a girlfriend. How could he not think about her? All right, it's time to get off work. We can finally leave. As soon as she stepped out of the police station, Lily felt the cold wind blowing and shivered. Lily was only wearing a long sweater and a thin pair of leggings. In such a cold and windy night, this kind of equipment looked particularly thin. Shivering from the cold, Lily felt that this man was extremely hateful. He had nothing to do. Why did you have to find trouble for me? Lily held onto his hand. Her movements were not very gentle as she shouted, Go down the stairs. Don't roll down. Unexpectedly, Ming pulled her over and said, It's so cold. You're still cold dressed like this. Do you know what I'm dressed like? Lily roared. Ming pulled her over and held her tightly in his arms. He said, Then let's get warm together. Chapter 1188. At that moment, Lily was touched by his warm embrace. Her heart fluttered slightly. The familiar embrace, the familiar smell, and the familiar person, but it can't be like this. Lily was annoyed, pushed his hand away, and shouted, Are you F asterisk king sick? Who do you think you are? Why are you hugging me? Disgusting. With that, she pushed Ming away. Ming's eyes were darker, and the street lights were reflected in his eyes. They were still empty and unfocused. Lily inadvertently turned her head and saw the man's loneliness at a glance. Pursing her lips, Lily stuffed his clothes back, pulled his sleeve, and shouted, Follow me down the stairs. Her tone was very bad, very bad. Even Lily herself felt that she was a little too fierce. However, a pair of eyes were staring at his feet, pulling him down step by step. Ming slowly followed her down the stairs. Just after he went down the stairs, he opened his clothes again and pulled her over. It's so cold. Lily had long been shivering from a cold. Suddenly falling into a warm place, she felt comfortable. But clearly feeling the temperature of the man behind her, Lily felt a little uncomfortable. What does this mean? Didn't we break up? What does he mean by hugging me like this? But the weather is too cold, so it will be much more comfortable. Forget it, I can't freeze myself. Otherwise the loss will outweigh the gain. Lily muttered in her heart, took the blind man to the side of the road, and stopped the taxi. Now that Ming and Lily were in such an awkward relationship, it was certainly impossible to take this guy back to the hotel where she was staying. When she got in the car, she asked, Did you bring your ID card? Lily originally did not have any hope. After all, this guy not only had no money, but also no mobile phone or wallet. How could he bring his ID card? Unexpectedly, Ming really took out a white card. Resident ID card. Lily took the ID card closer to look, and it turned out to be Ming's ID card. Seeing this ID card, Lily was even more suspicious and asked, What are you doing here? Ming did not speak, but slowly unbuttoned his clothes, trying to take them off. Lily saw this, pressed his hand, and asked fiercely, "What do you want to do?" "Take them off." One word, concise and comprehensive. However, the driver who was driving turned around and looked at them with a strange look. "Wear it, you idiot." Lily roughly helped him straighten his clothes and turned to the driver. "Let's go to a nearby hotel." The driver took a look and asked, "What kind of place are we going to?" "There are many hotels nearby. Go to a better one for 5 stars." Lily's heart was bleeding. This type of hotel was extremely expensive. But Ming, this bastard, could he get used to staying in ordinary hotels? But after saying that, Lily suddenly felt that something was wrong. Why did she have to think for him? She must be crazy. She then said, "Let's go to a normal hotel." The driver nodded and stopped at a traffic light. It looked very magnificent. Sure enough, Lily saw the big signboard at a glance. Sheraton Resort Hotel, F*CK, a 5-star hotel. Chapter 1189. But the arrow was already on the string, and Lily was too cold to speak. She grabbed Ming's clothes and walked inside. She went to the front desk and checked into her room. Lily took out Ming's ID card and slapped it on the counter. "One room." "Okay, please show me your ID card." The receptionist smiled politely. "I'm not staying here. He's staying alone. I'll send him up later." "Okay." The receptionist took Ming's ID card and was about to complete the formalities when she heard Ming say, "I'm not staying." Lily said, "Ignore him. I'll pay." Ming pulled her. His eyes were empty and unfocused. He said coldly, "I'm hungry. None of my business." Lily took his hand away. After Ming let go, he grabbed her again and said, "My last meal was yesterday at noon." In other words, he hadn't eaten anything since yesterday's dinner and the whole day. Even a man of iron wouldn't be able to bear such hunger. Moreover, Ming's stomach wasn't good. No wonder he had lost so much weight. His mental state didn't seem very good. Lily felt sorry for him, but she scolded him fiercely. "Can't you F*King behave when you're blind? Can't you just be a quiet blind man and be obedient? You're crazy." Ming didn't say anything. He tightened his grip on Lily's hand. The heat from his palm seemed to penetrate deep into her soul. Lily pushed his hand away and asked the receptionist, "Do you have food and beverages in your hotel?" "Yes, our kitchen provides 24-hour food and beverage service." "That's good. Ask him what he wants to eat later. Give him a single room. He's staying alone." "Okay, wait a moment. I can't stay." Ming pulled her hard and shouted at the receptionist, "Give me back my ID card. Is it your turn to speak?" Lily gave him a shove. "I'll call your mother to pick you up later." "You better behave yourself." Ming seemed to be throwing a tantrum. He pulled her hard and said, "I can't stay. Don't call me that. I don't want my ID card anymore. Let's go." "You're crazy." Lily was furious. She pushed his hand away and shouted, "I think you're not only blind, but also have a problem with your brain. I'm paying for you to stay in a 5-star hotel, and you're still acting like this? You should just stay here and calm down. I won't accompany you anymore." With that, she flung Ming's hand away. However, although it was only a single hand, its strength was shockingly great. Lily tried several times, but she couldn't let go of his hand. She shouted helplessly, "Let go." Ming pursed his lips and didn't say anything. As if sensing that Lily was really angry, he cautiously said, "Shall we eat first?" Lily closed her eyes and gritted her teeth in anger. Ming didn't seem to notice her anger and added, "I want to eat hot pot." Hot pot. In this kind of cold weather, eating hot pot was the best. Lily was tempted by his words, but then she became suspicious. "I thought you didn't like hot pot. Now I do," Ming said calmly. Lily glared at him and said, "Then let's get a room first. After eating, we can come and stay." You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.